Chapter 41. Third Year. Home Again. In the corner of the morning in the past, I would sit and blame the master first and last. All the roads were straight and narrow, and the prayers were small and yellow, and the rumour spread that I was aging fast. Then I ran across a monster who was sleeping by a tree, and I looked and frowned, and the monster was me. Saturday, 1st of September, 1973. After the first job, Craig and his gang had been so pleased with Remus they'd taken him along for 4 more, to houses and small businesses in the surrounding towns. Even without an invisibility cloak, Remus found that he just had a natural gift for getting into places he shouldn't. That's what Craig said, anyway. "Bloody natural, this kid." Nature was a funny thing, Remus found himself thinking on the way back to King's Cross. He remembered James leaving a bag of coins behind every time they raided Honeydukes. It was not in James's nature to steal, it seemed. But Remus didn't think this was a particularly fair assessment, when James had never needed to steal. He was the heir to an enormous fortune, just like Sirius. And the truth was, you just never knew what you were capable of until you tried it. It must be very easy to be good when you had no reason not to be. Still, Remus had resolved never to tell the other Marauders what he'd got up to that summer, and spent the rest of his journey daydreaming about all of the Christmas and birthday presents he'd finally be able to buy his friends. Remus's Hogwarts trunk this year was stuffed full of cigarette boxes and pouches of tobacco, plenty to get a little business up and running. If he was savvy enough, he might be rid of most of it before Christmas. They were allowed to go to Hogsmeade this year, and Matron had signed his permission slip without a fuss. Even Madame Pomfrey thought it was probably safe enough for him to go. Matron, it seemed, had learned her lesson. She accompanied Remus as far as King's Cross, then left him there with a curt goodbye. Heart-pounding as much as it had 2 years ago, Remus flew at the ticket barrier and exhaled only when he arrived safely on the other side. He was home again. It didn't take him long to spy Sirius, who was slouching against a station pillar beside his family. Mrs. Black was fussing over Regulus, who looked paler than usual and was standing with his back very straight as Walpurga combed his hair and hissed in his ear. She was obviously ignoring her eldest son, whose hair looked deliberately messy and whose robes were artfully rumpled and out of place. Remus thought it was best not to approach. "Hiya, Moony!" He was clapped on the back and turned round to see James and Peter grinning at him. James had grown a few inches and his face looked slightly thinner, but he had the same bright brown eyes and the same mop of black hair. Peter looked himself, though he seemed to be recovering from a rather painful sunburn. "Hi!" Remus grinned back at them, his heart leaping with excitement. Everything just as it should be. The whistle blew and they climbed onto the train to find an empty compartment and wait for Sirius. He was finally allowed to join them at what seemed like the last minute, and entered the car, muttering darkly to himself. "Keeping up my appearances, my arse!" "No change there, then." James winked at Remus. Sirius looked at them all, and his face split into a smile. That Sirius Black smile. "I thought I'd never see you all again." "Godric, you always have to be so dramatic." James punched him on the shoulder as they all stood up to greet him. "You don't know what she's like," Sirius whined, clasping James's hand in a warm, brotherly handshake. Then he saw Remus and smirked mischievously. "Is that you, Moony?" He deliberately craned his neck, raising a hand as if to shield his eyes and peering up. "Can you hear me up there?" "Ha ha," Remus replied, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm the same height as James." "Not any more, you're not," James countered, standing closer to Remus so that he could see he was indeed half an inch taller than the dark-haired boy. "Yeah, how did I end up mates with 2 beanpoles, anyway?" Sirius grinned, slapping Remus on the back playfully. "Lucky I've got you, eh, pretty boy?" "Hmm?" Peter looked up from his pastry, confused. Peter Pettigrew looked no taller than he had been when they were all 11, though he was considerably wider. Sirius appeared to be growing up gracefully and in perfect proportion, which was just typical. He was a little taller, but not lanky like James, slender, but not skinny like Remus. His jaw had broadened over the summer, too, the shadow of manhood raising in his features. "Right," James rubbed his hands together as they all sat down. "Now all that's out of the way, I say we move on to new business. Plans for the year?" "We have to finish the map," Remus said quickly. That had been playing on his mind for quite some time. "It's not far off, and I bet we can figure out their homunculus charm if we really put the effort in." "Definitely," James said. "The map is basically our legacy, right? We'll work on it, I promise." "That and the other thing," Sirius suddenly said very sharply. James and Peter exchanged glances, and Remus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What other thing?" he asked, frowning. James looked him in the eye, looking very serious. "Just something we were talking about last year. We'll let you know if we decide to go through with it." "Don't want to get you into trouble, Moony," Peter laughed nervously. "Less you know the better, eh?" Remus took umbrage to this. Hadn't he gotten away with participating in most of last year's pranks, and had the least attentions? And hadn't he been the one who'd even attempted to talk to Narcissa and Sirius about Sirius's family problems? Of course, they didn't know about that. If they had a secret, he could have one too. He looked out of the window testily, ignoring the rest of the conversation. Finally, Peter sighed heavily. "Where's the trolley witch? I'm hungry." "I just saw you finish a pastry," James replied, mildly annoyed, because he'd been midway through explaining his plan to bewitch all the Slytherin Quidditch team's brooms during their next practice. "Yeah, but I fancy something sweet," Peter pouted, emptying out his pockets and only coming up with empty wrappers. Remus saw his chance and finally cheered up a bit. "I've got you sorted, Pete." He dug into his suitcase and pulled out a handful of chocolate bars, dumping them on the empty seat beside him. The other three boys stared at the pile. "What are these?" Sirius picked up a Mars bar, looking suspicious. "Muggle chocolate," Remus said. "They're good. Go on, they won't bite." Peter had already unwrapped and bitten into a Milky Way and was grinning encouragingly at the others. Remus selected a packet of Maltesers for himself, sitting back with satisfaction, knowing that for once he'd brought the snacks on the train. Remus noticed that they were sitting further away from the teacher's table when they took their places for the feast. The first and second years now below them, the Marauders found themselves no longer among the youngest students, which gave them an unnecessary sense of pride and achievement. "You're taking runes, aren't you, Remus?" Lily asked, plunking herself down next to him. She'd cut her hair over the summer and had a soft fringe which made her look a bit like Jane Asher. "Yeah," he nodded. "Moony's abandoning us!" Sirius wailed comically, pretending to fall into James's shoulder, sobbing inconsolably. There, James patted his friend's back solemnly. "I hope you're happy, Remus," he scolded. "All very well for you, moving on to bigger and better things, but think about us little people you're leaving behind." "I'm not leaving anyone behind," Remus muttered, his ears turning red. "Just didn't fancy divination." "Ignore them," Lily said primly, casting a disapproving look at James and Sirius, who were now holding each other, still pretending to weep hysterically as though their hearts were irreparably broken. Lily tutted, seeing she had no effect, and turned back to Remus. "You lot don't have to be attached at the hip all the time. Anyway, I'm doing runes too. Have you done the pre-reading?" Remus nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, it looks really interesting." "Aha!" Sirius looked up slyly. "Now I see." "What?" Remus asked nervously. Sirius had that wicked, unpredictable look in his eyes. "I don't think it has anything to do with furthering your academic career." He scratched his chin wisely. "I think our dearie Moony has been lured away from everyone's favorite DOS subject by the fairer sex." "Shut up!" Remus blushed harder, trying not to look at Lily. Sirius always knew the most embarrassing thing to say. "Shut Ah, Black, Lily sighed. Honestly, you lot can't even be nice to each other, just because no girls would come near you with a 5-foot barge pole. I'll have you know I was very recently engaged to be married, Sirius replied with a swish of his dark hair. James was snorting with laughter now, shoulders shaking. What else are you taking, Remus? Lily asked, pointedly ignoring the other marauders. Cat of magical creatures, Remus sighed. He'd already had enough jokes about that from James and Sirius. Ooh! Marlene turned round suddenly. Me and Mary are taking that. Aha! Sirius said again, even louder, and James completely fell apart. Fortunately, the sorting began then, and the hall fell silent. The ceremony was extremely dull unless you were involved in it, Remus found, and he struggled to hold back a yawn, as the line of frightened first-years gradually grew shorter, and the spaces at the top of the Gryffindor table filled up with new students. His attention wandered, and he gazed over at the Slytherin table, where Narcissa was sitting at the far end, regal as a queen and looking much more cheerful than he'd seen her last year. Regulus, now a second year, sat at the other end from his cousin, looking as bored as Remus felt. Then there was Snape, among the third-year Slytherins, staring at Lily, as usual. He caught her eye once or twice, and Remus saw her smile at him in her usual friendly way, but it didn't seem to brighten Severus's mood one bit. Only Lily could remain friends with someone that miserable, Remus thought to himself. The feast, when it appeared, was as delicious and welcome as ever. Remus had his customary 2 helpings of everything, including pudding, and once the meal was finished, Dumbledore gave his usual speech. For the past 2 years, Remus had switched off for this portion of the evening, too full of good food and too sleepy from the long day to pay much attention. But something about the serious tone of the headmaster's usually playful oration made him listen. He saw that he was not the only one. There was a low, ominous muttering from the Slytherin table, particularly those in the upper years. The Gryffindors round Remus seemed to straighten up a little more, too. What was that about? Remus asked as they left the hall for their dorms, Dumbledore's confusing warnings ringing in his ears. Unity in the face of darkness and all that. Oh, right, you won't know, James said quietly. He looked at Sirius, who was scuffing his feet, hands in his pockets. Tell you when we're alone, okay? They waited to get that year's password, Codswallop, and headed right up to the stairs to their familiar dorm room. All of their beds were made, their trunks sitting by, and Remus felt a surge of happiness as he entered. Sirius began to unpack at once, pulling his beloved Muggle records and books from James's trunk. James only unpacked his broom and began to polish it lovingly, sitting cross-legged on his bed. So? Remus asked impatiently. The weird speech! Oh, yeah. James swallowed. He glanced at Sirius again, who appeared to be ignoring them. James sighed, running his hands through his hair. It's all politics, really. Politics? Remus groaned inwardly. He didn't know much about Muggle politics, let alone whatever went on in the wizarding world, other than the Statute of Secrecy, which they'd covered in their first-year history. There was a referendum coming out about Britain joining the European Community, but that wasn't for a few years. If Remus understood the Prime Minister's speeches correctly, and he couldn't see how that affected wizards very much. Well, you know there are, dark wizards? Yeah. Remus tried to look knowledgeable. He remembered reading something briefly about Grindelwald, but they wouldn't be studying that until their OWLs. There's been a surge in dark magic lately, that's all. And my dad told me. There's some stuff going on at the Ministry. Department heads pushing for stricter reforms against Muggle-born wizards and people who are different. Dad said it's nothing to worry about, just the old usual prejudices, but I suppose Dumbledore thinks we need to be on our guard. Mother and Father called a meeting, Sirius said suddenly. They both looked at him. He looked tormented, ashamed, and would not meet their eyes. They wouldn't let me in, obviously, but Reg went. They kept talking about this Dark Lord. I don't know, maybe a politician they want back in next election. All I know is if the Blacks are supporting him, he can't be good. Even James didn't have anything positive to say in light of this announcement. They were all quiet, until Peter spoke up. "We're at Hogwarts," he said. "My mum always says Hogwarts is the safest place in Britain, and we've got Dumbledore," he said firmly, settling the matter. "Come on, Black. Bet you've got another awful Muggle record you're just dying to assault our ears with." They all looked at Peter with mild surprise. Sirius grinned. "Actually," he said, dusting off his record player, "I have." Chapter 42. Third Year. Fantastic Beasts. Friday, 7th of September, 1973. By the end of his first week of third year, Remus felt like he needed another 2 months just to recover, and there hadn't even been a full moon yet. He felt foolish for not considering that adding 3 extra subjects to his timetable would also increase his workload, but of course it did, and by the time Friday rolled around, he felt weighed down by the amount of homework to be completed over the weekend. "It's not fair," Peter whined. "This year was supposed to be fun, with Hogsmeade and everything." "We'll still go to Hogsmeade, Peter," James murmured over a complicated-looking star chart. "I'm with Pete," Sirius groaned, screwing up his dream diary for divination. "Let's sack this off and go and use the Quidditch pitch while it's still light." James looked up eagerly. "Yeah, go on then." All 3 of them stood. "No thanks," Remus said absent-mindedly. He was actually quite enjoying his transfiguration homework, an essay on bodily transformations. He was pretty good at basic modifications now, for covering up scars, and was able to answer the questions at length. "Don't fancy looking over my Muggle studies, do you, Moony?" said Sirius mattily. Remus raised his eyebrows. "If I have time. James, Pete, want me to look at yours?" "Thanks, Remus," Peter grinned, tying up his shoelaces. "Nah," James refused. "Thought I might ask Evans for a bit of help on it later on." "Losing battle, mate," Sirius counselled. "Dunno why you're so hung up on her." James just shrugged, not looking at all discouraged. Remus spent a satisfying hour or 2 by himself, completing the rest of his work for the week. He'd made a start on potions, but thought it could bear leaving for a bit longer. Peter could give him a hand in exchange for the Muggle Studies comprehension homework. They had double potions on Mondays now, first thing, but thankfully no longer with the Slytherins. In fact, the only class they shared with Slytherin now was arithmancy, and that wasn't a practical subject, so there was much less space for open-house warfare. Arithmancy was a real surprise to Remus. He'd expected to fall behind Sirius and James, at least at first. But it appeared that this subject was down to logic rather than magical ability, and Remus had found his first lesson to be shockingly straightforward. The homework, which he knew Sirius and James had not yet attempted, was to calculate their own heart and character numbers using the Agrippin method. This he found quite soothing, though he knew he would never admit it to anyone. Herbology plodded along at its usual pace. Remus couldn't pretend at all to be interested in it, but at least it wasn't difficult. Astronomy wasn't his strongest subject either, but luckily Peter was generally so thrilled to be the only one who knew something that he gave Remus most of the answers for nothing. Then there was his new favourite subject, care of magical creatures, on Wednesdays and Thursdays. He wasn't going to tell the others about that either. They'd already teased him for liking history so much, and for taking runes. All good-natured, of course. He'd made fun of them for doing divination, which by the sounds of it was pretty dire. He'd read his copy of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them twice over the summer. It had been his favourite bedtime reading. The pictures and descriptions were so vivid they filled his dreams with the most spectacular images. There had been nothing in the set text, Remus was sure to check this, about werewolves. Fortunately, they weren't considered in the same league as magical creatures, and it looked as though they weren't going to be studying half-humans until next year in Defense Against the Dark Arts. "I hope we do unicorns," Marlene sighed, leaning against the wall as they queued outside the classroom for their first visit. "Something really nice like that." Mary raised an eyebrow. "I'd rather do dragons. Something a bit exciting." "I'm just glad we don't have Kettleburn," Marlene replied. This made Remus pay attention. "Don't we? Who've we got then?" "Weren't you paying attention to Dumbledore at the feast?" Marlene looked at him disapprovingly. Kettleburn's off in Romania or Bulgaria or something, doing work for the ministry. Don't know how useful he is, though. He's not exactly in one piece. So who've we got? Whoever it was at the feast, Marlene shrugged. But my timetable says Professor L. Ferox. As she said this, the classroom door opened and the fifth years ahead of them filed out, chatting animatedly. The Gryffindor third years went inside, and Remus took a desk by the window next to Marlene. When the teacher emerged from his office, both Marlene and Mary, and actually every other girl in the class, sat up a little straighter. He was a good deal younger than Kettleburn, who'd been a bit grizzled even in his middle age. Remus would have guessed his teacher to be in his early 30s. He still had all his limbs, too, which was a definite plus. His hair was thick and sandy blonde, long enough to reach halfway down his back. He wasn't dressed in robes like most teachers, but practical outdoorsy clothes and heavy brown leather boots. He had a slightly weather-beaten face, which served to give his strong features a kind of rugged appeal. His eyes were bright blue and gleamed as he smiled warmly at the class. "Good afternoon," he boomed in a gruff Liverpudlian accent. He clapped his large callous hands together. "Welcome to your first year of Care of Magical Creatures. I'm Professor Ferox. You've all got the Scamander text, I hope." The class immediately pulled out their copies of Fantastic Beasts along with parchment and quills, then looked up at him attentively. Professor Ferox continued to beam at them all. "Excellent," he continued. "A cracking read, as I'm sure some of you have already discovered. It gives you a nice, comprehensive guide to identifying and encountering most of the well-known magical creatures, but what it can't give you, and what you'll need to excel in this class, is quick thinking, cool-headedness, and nerves of steel." Some of the girls tittered at this, and Remus felt a flutter of excitement. "See, James," he thought ruefully, "it's not a girly subject." He wasn't sure about the specifications, though. He had enough nerve, maybe. Had to, after the summer he'd had. But cool-headedness was hardly one of his defining traits. "Now!" Ferox clapped his hands together as if eager to begin. He bent under his desk. "Look what I've got for you." When he rubbed his palms, the rough skin made a soft shh sound. He obviously didn't spend a lot of time inside, Remus thought to himself. Professor Ferox was clearly a man of action. The teacher was now lifting a large wicker basket, letting it gently down on his desk. He opened it, and a large furry creature walked out. It was the biggest cat Remus had ever seen, with bushy silver fur patterned with dark spots, high pointed ears, and a strange brush tail like a lion. It mewed, rather grumpily, then hopped up to sit on top of the basket so that it was almost eye level with Ferox. It glared imperiously down at the class, flicking its tail back and forth. Professor Ferox stroked a long finger down the animal's back, which it appeared to tolerate, blinking slowly. "Can anyone tell me what sort of creature Achilles here is?" "It's a cat," Mary said bluntly without raising her hand. Ferox laughed cheerily. "A common mistake, miss. MacDonald, Mary MacDonald." "Miss MacDonald? No, Achilles is not a cat, though they are often interbred." "Oh!" A Ravenclaw boy at the back of the room raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Stan Brooks, sir. Is it an easel, sir?" 5 points to Ravenclaw." Ferox nodded enthusiastically. "Achilles is an easel." Remus sighed inwardly. He knew that. He ought to have known it anyway. He could remember reading about the tale. Mentally, he struck quick thinking off the list of Ferox's requirements. Hoping to show the professor he was at least eager to learn, Remus began to take notes as Ferox spoke, still stroking Achilles absent-mindedly. "You can always identify an easel by its cat-like appearance, high level of intelligence, speckled fur, and plumed tail," the teacher said, indicating these features lovingly. "They are classified by the Ministry of Magic as XXX. Can anyone tell me what that means?" Remus's hand shot up this time, but so did Marlene's. Ferox picked her, asking her name as he did so. "Marlene McKinnon," she smiled up at him. "Sir, XXX classified creatures are not recommended for domestication, but should not prove difficult for a qualified wizard to handle." "Excellent! 5 points to Gryffindor." Ferox tipped his head. Remus fumed silently. She'd read that straight from the book. Ferox carried on. We will be focusing on XXX classified creatures for the rest of the year. Now, while it's true that Kneazles are not recommended as pets, this is not because they are dangerous. In fact, anyone who tells you they're dangerous has likely found themselves on the wrong side of one and should not be trusted. Can anyone tell me why? Remus's hand flew up again. It was all coming back to him now, but Ferox picked another Ravenclaw this time. Because they can detect suspicious people, Davy Kirk piped up, earning another 5 points from Ravenclaw. Absolutely, Professor Ferox smiled. Kneazles are excellent judges of character and will react fiercely to anyone untrustworthy. As such, the Ministry requires Kneazle owners to put proper licenses and have undergone certain proficiency tests. But as you can see, he stroked Achilles once more. The silver cat barely moved a muscle except to survey the class. They do make wonderful pets as long as they are shown proper respect and care. Is he yours then, Professor? Mary asked, batting her eyes flirtatiously. He's lovely. He is indeed, Ferox replied. If you're careful and don't crowd him, Achilles will probably let you stroke him. Line up, class. There was a general murmuring and scraping of chairs as everyone got to their feet and formed a queue. Remus made sure he was at the very back, so that maybe the lesson would end before he got to the front. Achilles was sure to hate him. Werewolves were the very definition of untrustworthy. Approach him slowly and don't avoid eye contact. If he tries to go for you, he'll use his claws, so keep alert. There we go. He'll let you stroke him now, nice and gently. As the class queue shortened, the professor continued talking, giving them encouragement and interesting facts interwoven with his own anecdotes. Remus didn't know what Ferox had done before becoming a teacher, but he'd certainly had some adventures. Travelled everywhere, it sounded like. Finally, Remus was at the front of the queue. He felt frozen to the spot, looking at the yellow-eyed animal nervously. Come on, then. What's your name? Professor Ferox beckoned him forward. Remus didn't move. Remus Lupin. Cats don't tend to like me, he mumbled. Achilles is not a cat, the teacher said, still smiling. Come on, Lupin, up you come. Remus sighed heavily and approached. He didn't want someone as cool as Ferox to think he was a wuss. Achilles watched him walk forward. It did look very intelligent. There was something in its eyes, even though it had a very ugly snubbed nose. He reached his hand out, allowing the Kneazle to sniff at him. Its claws weren't out, but Remus was willing to bet they were very long and very sharp. He'd been scratched by cats before and had never really liked them. Very good, Professor Ferox was saying. Now a bit closer and give him a stroke. Go on. Swallowing hard, Remus obeyed, ready to jump back if he had to. But Achilles seemed not to mind that he was a werewolf. Instead, he actually began to purr as Remus rubbed him tentatively around the ear, closing his eyes and looking completely docile. There we are! Professor Ferox cheered, delighted. Excellent judges of character, Kneazles. Now we haven't got long left, so if you all just make a note of the homework. Remus stroked Achilles for a little longer. The creature seemed to be enjoying it so much he felt bad for stopping. That was good, wasn't it? Marlene chattered as they left their first lesson. I hope he always brings in things for us to look at. Not going to be very practical when we get to the 5X creatures, Remus said. Maybe he'll bring Achilles in, though, Marlene replied hopefully. Who cares about his cat? Mary nudged. He's bloody gorgeous. Yeah, Marlene giggled. I wonder if he's single. Remus sighed and then began to lag behind the girls. They were a nightmare when they got on the topic of boys, and it was best to stay out of their way before they started waxing lyrical about James and Sirius. He began to daydream as they meandered in the direction of the great hall for lunch. It had been a better lesson than he expected, and even though Ferox hadn't given him any house points, he'd essentially said that Remus had a trustworthy character. No one had ever said anything like that to him before, and it made him feel unusually pleased with himself, a peaceful feeling when they carried on through lunch into their potions lesson later that day, and was still going strong that night as he drifted off to sleep. He dreamed of lions. Chapter 43. Third Year. The Hogwarts Black Market. Wednesday, 12th of September, 1973. Ugh, go back to bed, Lupin, Sirius threw a shoe at him from his bed. "Sorry!" Remus cringed guiltily as he quickly pulled the curtains shut, throwing the room back into darkness. It was 5 a.m., and he was awake. More awake than he'd ever felt in his life. He crept downstairs, not wanting to disturb anyone else, clutching a shoe box under one arm. With a brand new book to read, Remus set up camp in the most comfortable armchair in the deserted common room. He often came down early on mornings like this, when his body simply refused to sleep and he had so much energy he thought he could run laps round the castle without breaking a sweat. Remus had actually never tried this. If anything, he tried to push the strange urge away, lock it up, and focus on his mind instead. Still, he struggled to concentrate on his book. He thought about going for a walk, but they really weren't allowed out of bounds until breakfast began at 6. Ugh. He had to try not to think about breakfast or his stomach would start growling. Never mind that he'd had 3 helpings of mashed potato with his beef stew last night. Even Peter had looked impressed. Even if it was time for breakfast, he said he'd be in the common room for an hour from 6:30 onward. This was the ideal time, he'd decided. No one expected you to be up to anything nefarious that early in the morning, and the other Marauders typically didn't get up until 7:30, even on weekdays. Sirius would stay in bed longer if he possibly could. James sometimes got up for an early morning broom practice, but not usually until after 7. Remus looked down at the shoebox in his lap. He could cast a quick misdirection charm if James came down sooner than expected. That wouldn't be too difficult. Mind you, the state of his magic was in at that moment he'd better not do it while the box was in his lap, or he ran the risk of vanishing something more vital. He'd already been to Madame Pomfrey once this term, attempting to grow his hair out in transfiguration. He needed James and Peter to help him carry his rapidly growing locks to the hospital wing. Sirius had been laughing too hard to be of any use at all. Remus experimented levitating his book, but it shot up to the ceiling, smacking it hard before plumbing it back down to the floor. He sighed. He could do nothing but sit still and wait, it seemed. He wished he could have the record player on. Sirius had left it in the common room along with his newest albums from Andromeda, Aladdin Sane and Led Zeppelin 4. Sirius had been listening to Black Dog on repeat for weeks now. Remus opened the shoebox and took a quick inventory, though it was unnecessary. This would be his first sale, if anyone came. He'd spoken to a few 5th years he'd seen smoking the year before and got them interested. They seemed to be under the impression that muggle fags were somehow more potent, or maybe just more exotic, than wizarding ones. He did nothing to discourage the idea and told them to spread the word. Sirius had once obtained an exhaustive list of all the Hogwarts school rules, suggesting that they attempt to break every one until they reached 7th year. Remus read through it and had found nothing that mentioned tobacco trafficking, not if you took the language very literally anyway. Besides, it wasn't going to be a regular thing. He'd only had the stuff he brought with him. He planned to give it all a bit more thought, to wait until after the full moon, but then he found that their first Hogsmeade weekend was coming up on the 15th, and he decided he needed to get a move on. James and Sirius had already planned the trip out in full without consulting Peter or Remus, who were just happy to trail after them as usual. Honeydukes, obviously, and Zonkos to stock up on dung bombs. Then the Shrieking Shack, because James's dad didn't believe it was haunted, which meant James didn't either, and Sirius wanted to prove them both wrong. Then they were very keen to have Remus try something called butterbeer. Remus had his own plans. He was going to tell them that a long-lost aunt had died and left him with a very small amount of money. This would hopefully be enough of an explanation to satisfy James, who was certain to ask where Remus had acquired his newfound wealth. Remus felt sure that petty crime, even in the Muggle world, was not something James took lightly. Sirius might shrug it off, having little regard for rules in any setting, but he would probably also try to lend Remus some of his own money, which defeated the whole point. "Lupin, that you?" A 6-year had come down the stairs from the boys' dormitory, still looking bleary-eyed, clutching an NEWT textbook. "Yeah." Remus sat up straighter in the armchair, roused from his daydream. "Great, did you say 5 sickles for a pack of 20? "That's right." Remus opened his box, quickly gesturing the 6-year over. They made the swap, and the 6-year scurried out of the portrait hole, probably off for a morning fag before the library. The little silver coins rattled heavy in Remus's hand, and he grinned to himself. He was selling everything for twice the market rate, but if people were willing to pay. He made 2 more sales to some 5th years and to a 7th year girl who bought a pack of loose tobacco and asked if he had anything more fun for sale. He was a bit confused by what she meant, and she just repeated that he only had pre-rolled and loosed. She shrugged. "I'll ask Martha Ebhurst in Hufflepuff. She's usually got good stuff." Remus nodded, still not really sure what she meant. Either way, it appeared that he was not the only student in school with an entrepreneurial mind. By 7:15, Remus' shoebox was half empty and his pockets jangling. Deeply satisfied, he packed everything away as the common room filled up with students beginning their days. "Watch her, Remu!" James came bounding down the stairs, broom in hand, just as Remus was heading up them. "You're up early." "Yeah, I couldn't sleep," Remus replied evasively. Fortunately, James was eager to get on to the Quidditch pitch and didn't pay any attention to the shoebox or the strange clinking round Remus's robes. "See you for lunch?" he called, already halfway across the room. "Yes," Remus nodded, hurrying on his way back up the stairs. In the dorm room, Peter was in the shower and Sirius was still asleep, covers thrown over his head. The only part of him visible was his black hair spilling out onto the white pillow. Remus crept silently over to his bed and deposited his money and goods before collecting together his books for the day. James had obviously yanked back the curtains before leaving, and Remus thought with some annoyance he'd not received the same rebuke from Sirius that he had. There was enough light for him to neatly sort through his homework and carefully stow it in his bag. He'd done all the work that was due for the next few days, unsure how much time Madame Pomfrey would make him stay off lessons. He hoped not too long. He'd asked James to make a note of the homework for their shared classes, but he'd be missing care of magical creatures and runes too. He couldn't very well ask any of the girls to get the right notes for him, not without asking him where he'd be. His stomach rumbled again. He wondered if James was having breakfast right now. Potter often ate food on the go, always rushing off to one place or another. The bathroom door creaked open, and Peter peered round the door, head still wet and cheeks pink from the shower. He waved and mouthed, "Morning, Moony." Remus raised a hand in response. Peter looked at Sirius, who was still a lump in the duvet, anxiously before tiptoeing carefully over to his own bed to fetch his tie. Remus watched with some amusement as Peter attempted to gather his things without making so much as a sound. There was a fine line, Remus thought, between showing respect for your dormmate's sleeping habits and just being a complete and utter wuss. It was mean of him, but Remus was feeling particularly wicked that morning. Blame it on the moon. He pulled his wand slowly from his pocket and waved it very slightly, whispering under his breath. In an instant, Peter's book bag slid off the end of his bed, landing with a heavy thud, which reverberated off the bedroom's stone walls, rattling the window panes. Wide-eyed, Peter froze, going pale. He shot a look at Sirius, who was stirring, and practically fled from the room, leaving his tie behind. Remus wheezed with laughter, having to sit down on his own bed, clutching his stomach. When he opened his eyes, still catching his breath, Sirius was wide awake, still lying in bed, propped up on one elbow, staring at Remus as if he was mad. "You did that on purpose, didn't you?" Remus shrugged and nodded, standing up again and returning to his pile of homework. Sirius threw a pillow at him. "Knob!" "What? Pete looks like such a prat tiptoeing round you. Couldn't help myself." "Not very gallant of you, picking on the weak, Moony." Sirius yawned and stretched. "He's fine." Remus waved a dismissive hand. "I'll take him his tie. Anyway, someone had to get you up. Come on, it's breakfast." Sirius yawned again. "Bring me something up." "No." "James would," Sirius whined. "James isn't here." "Peter would." "As we've established." Remus sat, hoisting his book bag up on his shoulder. "Peter's a coward." Sirius groaned and leaned back. "Fine, I'll get up. Wait for me." "I'm hungry," Remus complained. "I won't take long. Just treat it as penance for waking me up." "You threw a shoe at me this morning." "Did I hit you?" "No." "Well then." Sirius got out of bed, grabbing his uniform. "Serves you right anyway, getting up at stupid o'clock." "Couldn't sleep," Remus said. "I think it's the moon." Sirius stopped outside the bathroom door. He looked at Remus with something like pity. if Sirius Black even had it in him to feel sorry for anyone but himself. Remus regretted saying anything. He didn't want pity. He rarely brought up the full moon for exactly that reason. "Sorry, Lupin," Sirius said. Do you worry about it?" "No, it's not like that," Remus said hurriedly. "I just get restless. Hungry, too, so hurry up." He laughed lightly to show everything was fine. Sirius smirked, disappearing into the bathroom. "You ought to be grateful, Moony," he called from inside, turning on the shower. "Not many Gryffindors would be able to have a lie-in when they know they're sharing a room with a restless werewolf." "Wanker," Remus called back. Thursday, 13th of September, 1973. He woke up upstairs, which was unusual. There were mice in the house. He knew that because he often saw them before he transformed. Perhaps once he turned, he chased them, but he didn't think he ever caught any. 3 of his fingers were broken, but at least his shoulders weren't dislocated. That had happened twice already this year. Before moving, Remus made a series of mental checks from top to toe. What hurt? How much did it hurt? Was he numb anywhere? Did all his limbs move when he wanted them to? No, it seemed all right. A few scratches, none too deep. He'd got off easy. Perhaps the wolf was happy to be back at Hogwarts too. He got up from the floor and limped over to the window. Sometimes his knees got a bit out of joint, but this morning they were only sore. He tried to squint through the gaps in the boards, but it was no good. The house was sealed up tight. "Remus, dear!" Madame Pomfrey's voice drifted up the stairs. "Coming," he croaked back hoarsely. His clothes were downstairs, so he'd ripped an old blanket from the bed with his good hand and wrapped it round himself. "What have I told you, boys? He can't have visitors on the first day." Madame Pomfrey's scolding interrupted his dreams. Remus blinked, yawning. The hospital was dimly lit, curtains drawn. It must be evening already. His stomach grumbled. He wondered if he'd eaten anything yet or if the nurse had let him sleep instead. He lost so much time after a transformation. Like his bones, nothing seemed to fit together quite right. "It's been almost a day," Peter's voice now. "We brought him chocolate." "Well, that's very nice of you, dear." Madame Pomfrey's voice softened a little. She wasn't a natural disciplinarian. "But Mr. Lupin is asleep." "I'd love some chocolate," he called out, hoping they could hear him. His throat felt raw. The curtain whipped back to reveal Peter, James, and Sirius standing there looking triumphant. "Hiya, Moony!" James and Sirius chorused, plonking themselves down at the end of the bed, either side of his ankles. "Here you go!" Peter dropped 3 chocolate frogs into his lap. "Cheers!" "Well, if you're up anyway," Madame Pomfrey sighed, "I'll go and fetch you some proper food. 1/2 an hour, boys. That's all." "Here's your homework, you big weirdo." James pulled out some parchment from his bag, handing it over. "James, you're a lifesaver." Remus put it on his bedside table for later. "And here's the rest of it." Sirius handed him some more. "I had to wait outside your Care of Magical Creatures class for half of lunch, so you better get top marks on that." "You did?" Remus stared at Sirius, amazed. Sirius nodded imperiously. "I did. Got to say, too, bit jealous. Looks like a really interesting subject. Wish I wasn't stuck doing divination." "But what about me?" James said, gasping dramatically. "I see plenty of you," Sirius retorted, giving him a shove. "Such a fickle heart," James sighed, making large eyes at Sirius, so that Peter began to giggle uncontrollably. Sirius shoved James again, and James leapt at him, pulling him into a headlock and tussling Sirius's hair. "Oi, Moony!" Peter said suddenly. "Our Bella Fenchurch gave me this for you." He set down a handful of sickles. "She said you knew what it was for?" Yeah. Cheers, Pete." Remus hurried to try to gather up the coins and hide them under his pillow. I had this chocolate frog card she really wanted. Aglanike of Thessaly." "Oh, I wanted that one." Peter looked hurt. Remus shrugged. "Sorry, mate. Money talks." Chapter 44. 3rd Year. Hogsmeade. Saturday, 15th of September, 1973. Pack your cloak, James. Why? You never know, do you? Fine, but I doubt we'll want it. Don't you forget you owe me a galleon on that bet we had. I haven't, James returned patiently. Just relax for a minute, will you? Never, Sirius grinned back. You do realize this is the most excitement I've had in months? I wasn't even allowed to go to Diagon Alley this summer. You had more going on than I did, James replied resentfully. At least you had that betrothal drama. My family's so boring. Shut up, Potter. Your family's amazing and you know it. I definitely had the worst summer. I had a great time in France, Peter piped up, but no one paid him much attention. What about you, Moony? James asked as they wended their way down the stairs into the common room. A gang of excited third-years was waiting, ready for their first trip to the village. They were watched over with a fond sort of nostalgia by the older students. What about me? Remus asked, pushing away flashbacks to the summer, the memory of wriggling through a tiny bathroom window and landing hard on his knees on the tile below. How was your summer? You haven't told us anything. Nothing to tell, Remus said. More boring than both of yours. No magic. I just read. Well, you're coming to mine for Christmas, James said cheerfully. They began to file out of the common room and head toward the front entrance. Same as last year, yeah? Moon's on the 10th of December, so we don't even have to worry about that. Remus gaped. How do you know when it is? He hadn't even looked that far ahead. Told you we were bored over the summer, Sirius elbowed him. We looked it up. For the next few years. But why? Remus was torn between feeling very touched and somewhat violated. It wasn't for them to worry about. It was his own private problem, and always had been. It's like Quidditch, James said. Whenever anything was important to him, he compared it to Quidditch. You've got to know your team's weaknesses in order to work their strengths. If you say so, Remus replied glumly, not wanting to talk about it much more. He'd hoped that once they knew about his condition, there'd be no more researching it behind his back. They could all get on with things in the way he preferred, which was to ignore the problem completely. The trouble was, nothing was private when it came to James and Sirius. Your whole life was up for grabs. Remus still wasn't used to this. As hard as he tried to keep up, there were just some things he would never want to share. It was all very well if you were James and had open parents who talked to you and listened to you in return, or Sirius, who was so outgoing and almost entirely shameless. Look who it is! Sirius nudged James, pointing at a dark figure waiting in the archway entrance. Lily pushed past the Marauders and went to meet him. Snape. Why are they even friends? James ran his hands through his hair distractedly. They grew up in the same town, Remus said as they carried on, watching the couple ahead, talking animatedly. One redhead, one black. How do you know? James rounded on him, looking affronted. She told me. You fancy her, then? James asked, clearly struggling to know how to react. Remus rolled his eyes. No, we just chat, he said firmly. And if you fancy her, then you might want to try it. He noticed this sort of talk creeping into their conversations lately. Sometimes he had to double-check he was talking to the Marauders and not Marlene and Mary. He fancies her, she fancies so-and-so, and so on. To make matters worse, Avni Chaudhry, a Gryffindor third year, was now going out with Ravenclaw fourth year Matthew Studd, and no one talked about anything else for days. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on it. It was mind-numbingly boring to Remus, for whom, aside from a few exceptions, girls were still generally incomprehensible. She likes you, though, James said. You did all your revision together last term. Only because you lot couldn't be asked, Remus replied defensively. They were approaching the town now. A clutter of pretty stone buildings sat just below them. And it's not like we were alone. Mary and Marlene were there too. We all need to take notes from Moony, Sirius teased. Birds follow him everywhere. How do you do it, Lupin? Those big brown eyes of yours. James and Peter sniggered, but Remus ignored him, walking a little bit ahead, hands in his pockets, still limping slightly from his last transformation. That was an utterly ridiculous suggestion, especially when it was obvious to anyone with eyes that Sirius was the best-looking boy in the year. It was clearer than ever, now that they were all getting taller, growing from childhood into adolescence. James had a certain amount of swagger. That came with wealth and skill on the Quidditch pitch. But Sirius was always going to be in another league entirely. Remus hadn't decided whether to be jealous about it or not, and tried not to think about it too much. When they finally reached Hogsmeade, Remus could not be more relieved. The village looked like some sort of place Remus had previously thought only existed in child's books. The cobbled streets gleamed in the yellow mid-September sunshine, and the higgledy-piggledy rows of black-beamed Tudor cottages might as well have been made of gingerbread and spun sugar. "Honeydukes?" James said. "Honeydukes," the others responded in unison. Remus had never entered the sweet shop through the front door before, nor had he ever been on the shop floor. It was packed to the rafters with boxes, jars, and bags of every kind of confection imaginable. Great trees of brightly coloured lollipops, as large as pinwheels, slabs of chocolate the size of paving stones, piles and piles of glittering sugar mice. The shop was also packed with Hogwarts students, and the Marauders had to push and squeeze to even get close to the goods. They filled their basket with enough sweets to last them until Christmas, at least, before queuing for the till, manned by a very harassed-looking wizard with white hair. Remus realized this was probably Mr. Honeyduke, and wondered whether the shopkeeper knew there was a secret tunnel in his cellar. After that, their next stop was Zonko's, the joke shop, which was just as busy as Honeyduke's, and one of the noisiest places Remus had ever seen. Every few seconds something seemed to explode, pop, or start whistling somewhere in the shop, accompanied by the delighted laughter or horrified shrieks of the students. James and Sirius were clearly old hands at practical joke shopping, and made an efficient sweep of the premises, weighing up the benefits and downsides of each contraption like a pair of bankers at the stock exchange. Half an hour later, they were finally leaving, weighed down with bags full of dung bombs, trick wands, exploding inkwells, hiccup sweets, and bars of frog spawn soap. Remus thought they'd perhaps been a little short-sighted doing all their shopping first, because next James and Sirius wanted to visit the Shrieking Shack, which meant climbing up the high street and facing an uphill climb, goods in tow. "So what is this place again?" Remus huffed as he struggled up the hill, his knee and hip still bothering him. "Haunted house," James replied, taking two of Remus's heaviest shopping bags from him without a word. "Most haunted place in Britain, Dad says." "It's not haunted," Sirius called from up ahead. "You Potters are just superstitious." "I heard that the ghosts there are really nasty," Peter said anxiously, struggling almost as much as Remus was with the steep incline. "Worse than Peeves." "Are they poltergeists, then?" Remus asked, curious. He'd been planning to do some reading about spiritus apparitions when he got the chance, after learning that it had been his father's main area of study. "Think so," James said. "The locals say they hear screaming coming from the house some nights." "Only for a few years, though," Sirius countered. "Poltergeists just don't move in at a moment's notice. It would have been decades and decades of disturbance and negative energy building up to—" "Oh my God." Lupin stopped still and almost dropped the bags he was still holding. He looked up at the house for the first time, and a cold chill struck the pit of his stomach. "What's up, Moony? Want me to take your other bags?" James was asking. Remus shook his head, speechless. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He'd never seen it from the outside before. They always came through the tunnel. But he knew the shade of the wood. He knew what the boarded windows looked like. "Bloody hell, if it's haunted, I think Moony's been possessed," Sirius said, sounding like he was only half joking. "Oi, Lupin, you're being weird. Stop it." "That's—" Remus struggled to find the words. He closed his eyes and tried to take a few breaths. "That's the house where they put me." James seemed to understand at once and put a hand on Remus's shoulder in a brotherly sort of way. "Okay, come on. It's time to go," he said. No one said anything as they began to trudge back downhill toward the town. Remus looked at the ground ahead the whole time, concentrating on putting one foot in front of the other and getting as far away from the shack as he could. The Shrieking Shack. Shrieking. He felt sick. James steered them in the direction of a quaint-looking pub. Inside there were lots of tables and comfortable chairs, not a far cry from the Gryffindor common room. They found seats in a quiet corner, and Remus sat, gratefully, his joints very sore now. James went to the bar, and Sirius and Peter sat down quietly on either side of Remus. "So, on the full moon, that's where you go?" Peter asked. Remus nodded, fiddling with a damp beer mat on the table. "It's not haunted, then?" Peter continued. "No, just me." "So wait, the shrieking is me." "But why—" "Shut up, Pettigrew!" Sirius snarled suddenly. Remus looked at him, taken aback. James returned with 4 bottles of amber liquid and set them down, taking his seat. "Butterbeer," he said brightly, pushing one toward Remus. "Try it, Moony, you'll love it." Remus raised the glass to his lips. He was still feeling a bit queasy, and the concoction in the bottle smelled very syrupy, but he found that sweet things usually helped if he'd had a shock. He took a sip and felt instantly warmed by the delicious liquid. He smiled at James, hoping they wouldn't ask any more questions. They didn't. Instead, they spent a very pleasant afternoon drinking butterbeer and planning how best next to utilize their new practical joke arsenal. Peter had the unusually brilliant idea of casting a remote timer spell on the dong bombs so that they could be triggered at any time from anywhere in the castle. "Excellent diversionary tactic," James exclaimed, excited. "Think of what we could get away with if Filch was chasing dung bombs on the opposite side of the building." "Give us time to work a bit more on the map, too," Remus added. "You're not seeing the big picture." Sirius folded his arms, leaning back on his chair. "We could set them all to go off at the same time. Imagine! We've probably got enough here to hide one in every classroom. Total chaos!" Sirius looked so enraptured when he said this that the other 3 were completely taken in, nodding furiously. "Oh, let's not sit here, Lily. It doesn't look very clean." Her nasty, bitter voice interrupted them. "They allow in all sorts, clearly." Sirius snapped forward in his chair, glaring at Snape, who was hovering next to a nearby table. "Don't be silly, Sev, it's fine." Lily shook her head, pulling out a seat. "All right, Evans." James waved at her compulsively, getting that stupid look on his face. "Leave us alone, will you, Potter?" Lily tossed her hair. "Hi, Remus." "Hi." He waved at her, grinning. He couldn't help enjoying the way she treated the Marauders. She was the only one who didn't fawn over them. "Ugh," Sirius said, holding his nose, looking at Snape. "What's that smell? Potter, did you trail something in on your shoe?" James sniggered. "Smells more like a dung bomb's gone off." "Disgusting," Sirius smirked. "Maybe we should open a window." Snape had gone white with rage. Lily put a hand on his arm. "Just ignore them, Sev. They're idiots." But Severus would not let Sirius have the last word. "How's the family, Black?" he asked, his voice wheedling, insidious. Sirius's mouth formed a hard line. Snape continued. "Regulus was telling everyone you had quite an exciting summer. So exciting, in fact, that you're no longer welcome back. "You don't know what you're talking about, Snivellus," Sirius spat. Remus knew it was too late now. Sirius had engaged, and there was no going back. "Don't I?" Snape raised an eyebrow, clearly thrilled at the reaction he'd incited. "Had any post from Mummy this year, Black? Heard anything at all from any of your relatives?" Sirius had a very odd look on his face. Remus had the impression he was realizing something for the first time and trying not to let Severus see it. James looked concerned, no longer laughing. "Ignore him, mate," he said quietly. "He's a prick. Ignore him." "I'm right, then." Severus's thin lips curled into a nasty smile. "No wonder you follow Potter around like a lovesick girl, when your own family don't want anything to do with you. When you've been disowned like that, I suppose all that's left is to associate with the dregs of society." He cast his black-eyed gaze over Remus and Peter. Sirius stood up, knocking his chair back. His wand was in his hand. He must have reached for it while Snape was talking. Remus stood too, his aching bones forgotten as he clenched his fists, ready to beat Severus senseless if Sirius gave the word. "Sirius, don't!" James went to snatch his wand away. They weren't allowed to perform magic in Hogsmeade. "Come on, Severus, let's go!" Lily had stood up too and was tugging her friend's sleeve. She looked furious with him, which was a small comfort to Remus. "No," Sirius said, his voice unnervingly steady and authoritative. "We're leaving. Come on, lads. I can't take the stench much longer." They did as ordered, even James, who only threw one longing look back at Lily on their way out. "That was really mature," Potter said, scratching his head as they stepped out of the pub into the warm evening light. Sirius snorted, starting back up to Hogwarts. "It's not over," he said, fiercely, the others jogging to catch up with his purposeful strides. "I'll show him. I'll bloody destroy him." The Marauders were at war. Chapter 45. Third Year. Noble and Most Ancient. Cold fire. You've got everything but cold fire. You will be my rest in peace, child. I've moved up to take a place near you. So tired. It's the sky that makes you feel tried. It's a trick to make you see wide. It can all but break your heart. Saturday, 15th of September, 1973. Knock, knock. Sirius. Nothing. Knock, knock. Knock. Sirius. Silence. "Oh, for the love of Sirius Orion Black III, I know you're in there!" James hammered on the door. "Piss off, Potter." James stepped back from the bathroom door and sat on his bed, looking dejected. Sirius hadn't joined them for dinner and had been locked in the bathroom now for 2 hours without making a sound. "Leave him alone," Remus said, turning the page of his book. He lay belly down on his bed, pretending he wasn't at all concerned. "He'll come out when he's ready." That was something he'd often heard matrons say. At least once a week, one of the St. Edmund's boys, usually a new kid, had a tantrum and locked himself in a room or crawled into some small space so no one could reach him. The response from staff was always the same. Ignore it until he realizes no one cares, until he realizes that nothing he can do will make a difference. It always worked. Remus knew his first hand. "It's not like him," James said, obviously disregarding Remus's draconian tactic. "I could kill Snape, you know, for saying that stuff." Remus shrugged. "Black already hates his family, though. I wonder why he let Snivelus bother him about it." James stared at Remus dumbfounded, as if he'd just said something unimaginably cruel. "They're still his family, Moony. They're horrible to him. Doesn't mean he doesn't care what they think." James sighed. "Look, Lupin, maybe you'd better go before he comes out. Go and find Pete in the library or something." "I'm Sirius's friend too." Remus sat up indignantly. Yeah, of course you are." James waved a hand. "But, well, if he's been crying, I think he'd rather no one else saw." "I don't care if he's crying. I want to help." This was a bit of a lie. Remus had always felt uncomfortable around crying people. He never knew what to do with himself. But he really did want to help too. Hadn't he always tried to help? More than ever, Remus wanted to come clean about having prompted Narcissa into the unbreakable vow, just to see James's face, but he calmed himself. It wasn't a competition, and even if it wasn't one he would win. "Okay," James said, "but you have to be understanding about it. You can't start a fight." "What are you talking about?" Remus was mortally offended. He never started fights. "You two, you're always bickering, I swear." "We do not bicker," Remus snapped. James just raised his eyebrows, which was infuriating. The dark-haired boy hopped off the bed once more and went back to the bathroom door. "Sirius," he knocked. "Please come out and talk to us." "Get lost, Potter. Leave me alone." James sighed again. Remus, annoyed with James, now just as much as he was annoyed with Sirius, got up too and strode over to the door. Indicating for James to move, he rapped hard on the wood himself. "I said, piss up!" "Sirius, it's me," Remus said, his voice hard and cold like matron's. "Look, if you're going to mope around like a big Jessie, then at least let us in so we can start planning our revenge." Silence. Remus tutted. "Fine, sulk, but you're being a selfish git. You know you're not the only one whose family hates you." "Remus!" James exclaimed, scandalized. Remus shrugged. It was worth a try. There was a shuffling noise inside the bathroom. Remus pressed his ear to the door, then reeled back as it opened. Sirius's gloomy face peered out. "Finally," James said, relieved. "Look, come out and—" "Moony can come in," Sirius said, opening the door just wide enough for Remus to squeeze inside, then slamming it back and fixing the lock. It was dark inside. "Lumos," Remus muttered. His wand point lit up, casting a pale glow over the white room and Sirius's pale face. He had been crying. His eyes were dark and red. Remus looked away quickly, glancing up at the light fittings. The bulbs were smashed. He tutted. "You and your temper, eh?" he said. "Reparo." The lights mended and flickered back on. Remus extinguished his wand light. "Didn't do it on purpose," Sirius sniffed, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. It was a sullen, childish gesture, somehow inappropriate for who Sirius was, even at 13, usually the epitome of grace and poise. "I still smash stuff sometimes, when I'm angry. My magic gets out of whack." "Oh, right," Remus nodded, though he'd never heard of that before. "So, revenge?" Sirius asked, sitting down on the toilet lid and looking at Remus expectantly. "Revenge," Remus agreed. "What did you want to do to him?" "Not just him," Sirius glowered. "All of them. Every single Slytherin in the school." Remus nodded enthusiastically. That sounded a bit bonkers, but it was a start. There would be time to talk him down later when he was acting less weird and wasn't in danger of blowing up any more light bulbs. "Yeah, we'll get 'em all, Black. Now, come on, let's go in." "I'm not coming out yet," Sirius said sulkily, crossing his arms. Remus sighed. He sat on the floor, leaning against the door. "Okay, fine. Want to talk about it? Because James is probably the best person." "Did you mean what you just said?" Sirius interrupted him again. "Do you think my family hates me?" "Oh, God, I don't know, do I? I'm not exactly the authority on families." Remus rubbed the back of his head. "I was just trying to get you to open the door, to be honest." He meant it as a joke, but Sirius didn't smile. He looked down at Remus through a curtain of black hair. "You said your family hates you." "Well, I suppose they must," Remus explained. "Otherwise they wouldn't... Well, I wouldn't have been sent to St. Edmund's, would I?" "Doesn't mean they hated you." "No," Remus reflected, "but I don't think they can have liked me very much all the same." "You're not... I mean, it doesn't bother you?" Remus shrugged. "Obviously sometimes, but, no one's entitled to a happy life." Matron had said that many times. For the first time saying it out loud, Remus wondered if she was entirely right. "Blimey, Lupin, you're a right downer, you know that." "You let me in." Remus kicked Sirius lightly in the shin with the toe of his trainer. "If you aren't cheering up, I'll go get Potter." "Nah," Sirius shrugged, smiling weakly. "You're okay." Remus laughed. "James didn't want me to come in. He just said we bicker." "He what?" Sirius shook his head. "We do not bicker." "That's what I said," Remus assured him. "My family," Sirius said suddenly. "I don't think they hate me. I think they want to like me, really. But I keep letting everyone down. It's funny most of the time, but... well, it isn't today." Remus didn't know what to say to that, so he kept quiet. He thought about Narcissa, vowing to face death if she could not marry Lucius. He thought about Regulus, who often stared at his older brother across the dining hall, green-eyed with jealousy. Families were messy business. Perhaps he ought to be grateful to Lyle Lupin for ending it all in one fell swoop, so that Remus never had to know whether or not he would have made his father proud, or whether he would have been a disappointment after all. Friday, 5th of October, 1973. I've got it! I've really got it this time! That's nice, Pete, Remus replied blithely, reading his arithmancy textbook. We should dye his robes pink. He'd just dye them back, it's too simple. Where would we even get his robes from? Remus turned the page and resumed his reading. Ah, bloody hell, there's something wrong with that bludger, Sirius shouted, standing up. Come on, McKinnon, move your bloomin' arse! Do you mind leaving her arse out of it? Mary snapped from a few rows up. They were watching the Gryffindor Quidditch practice. Well, Sirius, Mary and Peter were. Remus had just wanted to get on with his reading. Jealous, MacDonald? Sirius replied cheekily. Dye his hair pink, then, Peter persisted, shaking Remus's arm for attention. I've learned colour-changing spells now. I can do it. So can he, Remus said, jerking his arm back and searching for his place on the page. You know, Moony, you could show a bit more interest, Sirius said. In Quidditch or taking down your arch-nemesis? Both. Either. I'm here, aren't I? Remus turned another page. Who's your arch-nemesis? Mary asked, getting up and coming down to sit by Sirius. If I told you, I'd have to kill you, Sirius said dryly. Mary rolled her eyes. Is it Snape? All three boys looked at Mary in surprise. She laughed. Come on, you lot, it's not exactly a secret. You all had it in for each other ever since first year. Plus, Lily is one of my best friends. Don't talk to me about Evans, Sirius groaned. I hear enough as it is. I think she's an idiot going round with that creep, Mary said, rubbing her arm as if the thought of Severus made her skin crawl. You know, he made Marlene cry the other day. Called her dad something really nasty. Makes no sense either, because Lily says he's half-blood, Severus. Anyway, someone needs to teach him a lesson. Ah! Sirius barked. He's half-blood? Brilliant. Yeah, Mary said coolly. So's Remus, and I'm Muggle-born. So what? Remus finally looked up from his textbook to smirk at Sirius, raising an eyebrow at him. Sirius looked down, then back at the Quidditch. Nothing, he muttered. I'm not like that. Good, Mary said primly. I get enough of that shit from the Slytherins. Remus was inclined to agree with Mary, who had more backbone than he did, putting Sirius in his place like that. Insults from the Slytherins had definitely increased this term, though it might have only been noticeable to non-pureblood students. Remus had started to worry about travelling between classes himself, though he rarely had to. He had a few near misses anyway, and had been called a mudblood twice. He didn't tell James or Sirius this. It seemed a bit like whinging. Plus, as far as insults went, he'd felt like he'd been called much worse than mudblood. He didn't like the idea that it made Marlene cry, though. It was all very well that Remus got picked on by Snape and Mulciber, or even that puny, sadistic little Barty Crouch, but making girls cry was another thing altogether. Remus felt a surge of protectiveness and chivalry toward his friend. He clenched his fists, then unclenched them. The problem was that Snape wasn't the type to attack with hexes and big pranks. He could do both of those things. He was every bit as capable as the Marauders, but Snape relied on words to hurt people, and they were much trickier to counteract. Unless you changed the words. Oh! Remus put his book down suddenly. He grabbed Sirius's arm. Oh! What? Sirius frowned at him. He'd been absorbed in watching the training while Remus's mind had wandered. There'd been another opportunity for Sirius to join the Quidditch team this year, but he'd declined. Maybe because he changed his mind. Maybe because he didn't want to be embarrassed in tryouts again. We change the words, Remus gabbled. We change what he says. What are you on about? Sirius clicked his tongue. Snivelous? Yeah, there are spells where you can stop someone speaking, right? Sirius coloured lightly, looking at Remus. Yeah? Okay, so how much more difficult can it be to, twist their words? We could set a trigger word or a few. Mudblood or blood traitor, a half-breed, dung licker, or whatever. And instead, we make him say something really nice or really stupid, whatever we feel like. Moony, where did you hear all those? James scored a goal and Peter leapt up, clapping wildly. Potter did a few loops on his broom, showing off. Sirius grinned up at his friend. Mary's knee was touching Sirius's, Remus noted. They were sitting really close, actually. So, Remus grabbed Sirius's shoulder again, trying to get him to focus. What do you think? I love it, Sirius said simply. We should make him say something really ridiculous, like, I don't know, snuggle bunnies or something. We'll go to the library after this, yeah? Can I come? Mary asked. Sirius shrugged. If you want, I suppose. It's serious marauder business, though. Mary giggled. Remus wondered if Sirius found that as annoying as he did. He picked up his book and returned to arithmancy. 20 minutes later, the training session was over and the marauders were walking toward the castle. Mary and Marlene in tow, Sirius and Remus both babbling excitedly to James about their brilliant plan. It had somehow become their plan in Sirius's mind. You're supposed to be off the pitch by 5 o'clock, someone grunted in front of them. Remus turned to see the Slytherin Quidditch team walking toward them, brooms in hand, kits slung over their shoulders. We're leaving now, Bulstrode, bloody hell, James said, annoyed. The pug-faced Slytherin captain just scowled at him and pushed past, deliberately knocking James with his shoulder as he did so. Oi! Sirius pulled out his wand. James held him back. What's it to you, Black? Bulstrode sneered. If that's still even your name. The Slytherins all laughed, including the smallest, newest member who'd been behind the others. Regulus Black. It took James and Remus to pull Sirius away as the Slytherins snickered and whispered. Remember the plan, Remus whispered. Sirius slackened, then nodded. Promise me we'll get all of them, he growled. Chapter 46. Third year. The Slug Club. Monday, 8th of October, 1973. Sirius, you'd better come up with the replacement words. You're the most, verbose, Sirius supplied, yawning. Loquacious? Garrulous? Exactly, Remus smiled. I'll work on figuring out which spell we'll need, and James, you can figure out how we manage to cast it on the whole house. That's going to be really hard, I think. Peter, you better help with that. Hark at Moony, James laughed, buttering his toast. Giving the orders now. The Marauders are a socialist utopia, Sirius yawned again. We don't have leaders. Enjoying Muggle studies, are you? Remus raised an eyebrow. Sirius lay his head on the dining table, closing his eyes and flipping 2 fingers at Remus. An owl landed on the breakfast table. It was James's. Sirius's owl had been confiscated by his parents so many times that he may as well not have had one at all. Peter typically relied on school owls, and Remus never received any post anyway. What the hell? James opened the letter proffered by the bird with a frown. The Slug Club? Oh, yeah. Sirius opened a sleepy eye. I got one too. Apparently old Sluggy likes students who have a certain star quality. So me, obviously. And I suppose you too. Neither Peter nor Remus had received an invitation, but this was not much of a surprise. Peter was quite good at potions, but lacked aptitude for almost anything else. As for Remus, he tried to fly under the radar where Professor Slughorn was concerned. We won't go then, James said, folding up his letter decisively. All for one and one for all, us Marauders. I don't care, Remus shrugged. Go if you want to. I bet Lily's going. Do you? Yeah, she really is good at potions, isn't she? James said, getting that funny look on his face again. She's really good at everything. Probably the cleverest in the year. Oi! Remus and Sirius said in unison. James raised an eyebrow. Cleverest girl, then. Sirius closed his eyes once more, satisfied, and attempted to doze through the rest of breakfast. Thursday, 11th of October, 1973. The party was held later that week. James, still uneasy about the exclusion of the two lesser Marauders, tried to convince Peter and Remus to don the invisibility cloak and come anyway. Sirius thought this sounded like a good laugh, but Remus personally thought it beneath him. He had no desire to be among the chosen few. In the end, Peter declined too, though he clearly had been on the cusp of agreeing to the ridiculous scheme. Anyway, Thursdays were Remus's favourite day of the school week, specifically Thursdays from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. The slot in his timetable allotted to care of magical creatures. Their Wednesday lessons were always theory-based, and Remus liked those too. He'd never heard anyone talk about biology like Professor Ferox. After Neasels, they'd seen Doxies and Krups. This week were Murtlaps. Mary and Marlene squealed at the creatures Ferox presented in a large hutch-like run at the back of the classroom. Remus couldn't blame them. Murtlaps were extremely unappealing. They were rat-like creatures with masses of writhing tentacles sprouting from their backs like maggots. "We can't do Krups and Neasels every week," Ferox grinned, gesturing for them all to gather round. "Not all the magical creatures we learn about to be cute, but diversity is the spice of life, "I hope we don't have to touch them," Marlene whispered, shuddering. Remus didn't mind. They were gross, but he didn't mind gross things. He had a pretty strong stomach. Professor Ferox had already told him so. Last week, when they were watching the Doxy eggs hatch, Remus had beamed with pride all day long. Ferox was looking at Remus now. "Mr. Lupin, I'm sure I can rely on you to tell me the beneficial properties of Murtlap tentacles." Remus tried not to smile too broadly or look too much like a goody-goody. "They're really good for soothing superficial cuts and abrasions," he said promptly. "And if you eat them, they make you impervious to most common hexes." "Excellent! 5 points to Gryffindor." Remus couldn't help smiling a lot. Who cared about the stupid Slug Club? Slughorn was nowhere near as cool as Ferox. Ferox was clever and unpretentious and funny, and did dangerous things. Remus had never given much thought to having a career, but for some weeks now he'd been entertaining the idea that whatever he did when he grew up, he'd like to be just like Professor Ferox. Mind you, he'd have to start eating more or weight training or something, because if Ferox was anything, he was broad. And Remus, though he was inches above the other Marauders now in height, remained eternally weedy. "It's your metabolism," Madame Pomfrey told him when he'd asked one morning after a moon. "You could eat more or rest more, but it might be just one of those things, I'm afraid. I shouldn't worry, dear. You're as healthy as can be expected." That didn't sound at all reassuring, but he accepted it. His father had been thin, too, he was sure. At least he wasn't pudgy like Peter, who still looked like a little boy compared to the rest of them. This fact was made even clearer that evening, when Sirius and James stood fully dressed in their formal robes, looking every inch the young lords of the manor, and Peter sat staring at them enviously from his bed, already in his pyjamas. "Do you think they'll be dancing?" Sirius asked anxiously, straightening his tie. "Nah," James replied, desperately trying to comb his hair flat. "We'd have been told to bring partners or something." Sirius slumped on the bed. "I hate stuff like this. Moony, you go for me. Bet old Sluggy won't even notice." "Fat chance," Remus snorted from behind his copy of Verbal Assault, Defensive Tongue Twisters. "Slughorn can't even remember my name half the time, and he'll feel a bit short-changed when he's expecting a pure-blood black and gets the half-blood kid he keeps calling Linchpin. Ugh, he's such a slimy old tosser, like an actual slug." Sirius smirked to himself and nudged Remus with his elbow. "Eh? An actual slug, Moony?" Remus smiled back, looking up from his book. "Are you ready, then?" James sighed, tossing away his comb, apparently accepting that his attempt was futile. "I suppose," Sirius grunted, getting up laboriously. I'll come down with you, Remus said. Might as well go to the library. Want to come, Pete? Peter looked at him as if he was insane and shook his head. James, Sirius, and Remus made their way down to the common room where, much to James's glee, Lily was waiting for them in a very pretty turquoise dress. Unfortunately for James, however, as the three marauders approached, it became clear that it was not him she was waiting for. "Remus!" she said, standing up. "You look nice, Evans," James said hopefully. Sirius sighed loudly. "I wanted to speak to Remus," Lily said, ignoring James. "Will you walk with me to the party?" "Not going," Remus shrugged. "Not invited." "Oh!" Lily flushed a bit, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, I just assumed." "What did you want to talk about?" Remus asked impatiently. His book was heavy and the full moon was due on Friday, making him more agitated than usual. Lily eyed James and Sirius, clearly not wanting to say anything in front of them. Remus sighed. "I'm going to the library. If you want to walk that way with me, then fine." It would take Lily out of her way, but Remus decided he didn't care. He pushed through the portrait hole and heard her scamper after him, her patent black party shoes clicking on the flagstones. "What's the book?" Lily panted, struggling to keep up with Remus's long-legged stride. "Nothing," he said deliberately, covering the title with his arm. "Just some research." "It's not something nasty, is it?" Lily asked disapprovingly. "It's not another horrid thing to do to Severus?" "I knew that's what you wanted to talk about." Remus rolled his eyes, still walking. "Well, you have to admit, Sirius did start it that time in Hogsmeade. I mean, he did call "I don't care, Lily," Remus snapped, turning a sharp corner. "He didn't have to be so nasty. Sirius and James were just having a laugh, and Snape had to go and make it personal." "Oh!" Lily stamped her foot. "You're all as bad as each other." "You know he hates people like you, too, don't you?" Remus countered, stopping now that they were outside the library. He rounded on her. "You know that his sort hate our sort." "Our sort?" Lily tutted. "Honestly, this whole blood purity thing is getting ridiculous. And it doesn't excuse—" "He made Marlene cry," Remus persisted. "Mary told us. What do you think he says behind your back?" Lily's cheeks were pink again. "Seb would never say anything like that about me. He's my best friend." "Well, good for you, but the rest of us aren't so fortunate," Remus spat. Lily stared at him, blinking for a few moments, stunned into silence. She looked like she might cry, and Remus felt a tiny twinge of guilt. When she spoke again, her voice was meek and small. "What are you going to do to him?" Remus sighed. She might as well know. "Not just him. All of them," he said, lowering his voice and bending down slightly in case they were overheard. "Nothing bad. If he stops calling everyone else names, then nothing at all." She looked at him skeptically. He straightened up. "That's all I'll say. You'll be late for your party, so go on." Later that evening, Remus thought he'd just about cracked it. He was sitting up in the common room and had made his final notes. Now all he needed was Sirius's list of replacement words and they could begin work on the prank. It was almost 11 o'clock when the portrait hole swung open and Lily Evans marched in with a face like thunder. There were odd silvery marks on her dress that caught the light as she charged in. "What's up, Evans?" Remus asked tentatively, still feeling a bit sorry for being so short with her outside the library. "Ask them!" she hissed, furious. "I'm going for a shower!" He did not wonder who she was referring to, but if he had, it was answered within moments as Sirius and James came through the portrait hole next, laughing hysterically. Remus couldn't help but grin too. Their glee was infectious. "What did you do?" "It was all serious, mate." James clasped his friend on the back, then bowed to him elaborately, fluttering his hand. Sirius did the same back. "Couldn't have done it without you, my dear chap." "Done what?" Remus asked, trying to keep a lid on his irritation as it sprung up out of nowhere. "Slugs," James said. "Slugs! Bloody everywhere. Started with these little jelly slug sweets that were laid out to eat. Simple enough transfiguration spell, Sirius shrugged with false modesty, throwing himself into an armchair and slinging one leg over the arm. But then, James sat next to Remus, starry-eyed. Then they started to multiply. And is this why Evans is pissed off with you? Well, did you see the slimy bits on her dress? And, in her hair a bit too, I think. They were really fast-moving slugs. They kind of got everywhere. No sense of humour, that one, Sirius yawned. Sure to be thanking us for livening things up a bit. The nerve of some people, Remus said dryly. See, you understand, Moony, Sirius grinned. You'd let us slime you, wouldn't you? Remus thought it best to ignore that and address James instead. So did Slughorn know it was you? Yeah, it was pretty obvious. We were the only ones not screaming. Detentions? 3 weeks. Cauldron scrubbing. That's fine. Helps build up my muscles. James flexed his arms, which, it had to be said, didn't look particularly muscular. Good news, though, Sirius piped up. No more parties for us. We're out of the Slug Club. And into the history books, James crowed, causing all the 3 of them to dissolve into fits of laughter. Chapter 47. 3rd Year. James Potter and the Lumpy Elephant Dung. Tuesday, 30th of October, 1973. With Halloween and the traditional Hogwarts feast looming, Remus was keen to have the word-swapping spell perfected in time in order to have maximum reach. It's fine, Moony. We all know what we're doing, James said, returning from Quidditch practice covered in mud and soaking wet. The evenings were getting darker, and Remus hardly went to watch the team practice anymore, though Sirius and Peter usually did. Mary always went too, to watch Marlene. She was following them everywhere these days. I just think we should test it, Remus bit his lip, watching Sirius cast a drying spell on James. Oh no, Peter said, folding his arms. I won't be your guinea pig this time. Last time I couldn't get rid of that patch of purple hair for weeks. I'd forgotten about that, Sirius said dreamily. That worked really well once we'd figured out the kinks. Do it on him, Peter pointed at Sirius. It's his turn. Don't whinge, Pete, Sirius groaned. He flopped down on his bed. Do it on me, Moony. I'm not a coward. Okay, fine. Remus withdrew his wand. Sirius leapt up. Wait, you want to do it on me now? Well, the sooner the better. What about the counter-jinx? Well, I'm pretty sure I've got that sorted. Remus let a smile creep onto his face. He knew for certain that the counter-jinx worked, but it was too much fun to watch Sirius squirm. Oh, for goodness sake! James sighed, getting out of his Quidditch gear. Do it on me, Lupin, I don't mind. Only I don't want to say any of the words on that awful list of yours. Can you do it for something else? If you like, Remus replied. Yeah, about this list, Moony, Sirius said, picking it up off the bedside table. What? It's really long. Yes? Remus raised an eyebrow. What's your point? They're all insults for non-purebloods, aren't they? Yeah, Sirius said, scratching his chin. Yeah, they are. But, well, I just didn't think there were so many. Never seen them all written out like that. And anyway, where'd you hear all these? Where do you think? Remus met Sirius's eyes deliberately. He'd been waiting for something like this. Don't be a girl about it, Black. It doesn't bother me. Right, James, what word do you want to swap? Evans, Sirius said suddenly. Sick of hearing that name come out of his mouth. Okay, Remus smiled. Then change it to what? Don't tell me, James said. We'll do it as a blind test, so we know it definitely works. Pick something Black hasn't come up with yet. Remus nodded, scribbling something onto a piece of parchment, then raised his wand, concentrating. He flicked his wand sharply at James and uttered the incantation. All four of them stood by, silently, watching. Remus said. Do you feel anything? Nope. James looked down at himself as if he expected to see something different. Well, then say it, Sirius urged. Her full name, Remus added. James cleared his throat theatrically, squaring his shoulders. He outstretched one arm and placed a hand on his chest as though he were about to make some sort of grand announcement. Lumpy elephant dung, he proclaimed. Peter burst into a fit of giggles so strong he almost fell off the bed. Sirius whooped with laughter and James turned bright red. I didn't know you were going to pick something like that, he said. That's my future wife. Who's your future wife? Sirius asked quickly. Elephant dung, James replied, then clapped his hands to his mouth. Lupin! You said you didn't mind, Remus replied, businesslike. Now, try saying Evans again, but really try to break my spell, okay? Elephant dung, James said promptly. Then with more force. Elephant dung. He screwed up his eyes. Elephant dung. Lumpy elephant dung. He hung his head sadly. Peter could hardly breathe for laughing now, and Sirius had to lean on the bedpost for support. Excellent, Remus smiled. He put down his list. Hey, it's 6 o'clock. Shall we go for dinner? Yeah, just do the counterjinx first, James said. Oh, no. Remus shook his head solemnly. Sorry, Potter, but I want to test the spell thoroughly. We need to be sure it won't wear off too quickly. I'll unjinx you tomorrow morning. What? James roared. Oh, yes! Sirius gasped, wiping tears from his eyes. Sorry, said Remus again, not sorry at all. Just be glad we didn't pick a common word, I suppose. But what if I run into elephant dung? Oh, I don't think you will. Remus gave a small smile. Hardly any elephants in Scotland. James grimaced. You know what I mean! Lumpy! Lumpy elephant dung! Remus shrugged. Don't yell her name. Come on, I'm starving. James, look who it is! Shut up! James gritted his teeth and looked stonily at his dinner plate. Sirius shook his head disapprovingly, the picture of piety. That's no way to greet. What's her name? I'm not rising to it, you know. I'm stronger than that, James said, viciously cutting into his steak and kidney pie. She's right there, mate, Sirius said, trying to control his smirk. How will she ever notice you if you don't call her? Hi, Evans, Remus said suddenly, waving at the redhead. Want to sit with us? She stopped and looked at them warily. Why? You're a Gryffindor? We're Gryffindors, Sirius said, getting up to give her his seat next to James. We're supposed to sit together. Plus, it'd really bother Potter. Well, in that case... Lily sat down. Sirius pushed Remus up to make room beside him. Lily looked at James curiously, who had turned beetroot red. Why do I bother you, Potter? You don't, he said quickly. They're just being prats. Language, Potter, Sirius said severely, pouring gravy over his mashed potato and peas. That's no way to talk in front of a lady. What's going on? Lily eyed Remus suspiciously. Are you all making fun of me? We're making fun of James, Peter squeaked, sounding as though he was having a hard time containing his excitement. For once he was not the butt of the joke, and it was clearly a dizzying notion. I'm testing a spell on him, Remus said simply. Lily's eyes flashed as she analysed the situation. And what was the spell? Mutatio verbi. Her eyebrows shot up. Is that... My God, Remus, which word? Lumpy elephant dung, James said glumly. Peter spat out his pumpkin juice and knocked his fork flying. Lily giggled nervously. "What did you say, Potter?" Lumpy. James struggled to fight the spell. Lumpy elephant dung. Lumpy.
Lumpy, for God's sake!
Lily glared at Sirius. "It's my name, isn't it?" "Don't look at me," Sirius grinned, holding up his hands. "It was Moony's idea." Lily turned to Remus, her frown disappearing. "Really, Remus?" Yeah. But it wasn't meant to be offensive or anything."
That's amazing! Really clever magic. Oh, wait until tomorrow,
Peter said, recovering from his hysterics. Sirius kicked him under the table. "I'm so sorry, Elephant Dung," James said, looking genuinely forlorn. This time, Lily laughed. Wednesday, 31st of October, 1973. "Nothing's happening." "Well, they're not supposed to start insulting each other, are they?" "We have to push them into it. Pete, go and—"
Oi, I'm pureblood.
"Oh yeah, fair play. Moony, go up and trip one of them or something. Do it to Snivelus. Or my cousin. Yeah, get Sissy." "No," Remus said quietly. Ignoring the fact that he actually had no problem with Narcissa, he didn't want to be so obvious. "We'll just wait. Patience, Black, patience." "But it might take days." "It won't," Mary said stonily. "You three must be blind if you haven't seen what's going on round here." That shut them up. Mary was sitting beside Sirius for the second time that week. Remus didn't mind. He liked Mary. She was funny and brusque and bullshy, but unfailingly kind and full of compassion. She was his friend. But, well, she wasn't a marauder, was she? Her presence felt intrusive somehow, didn't quite mesh with their usual back and forth, and she always sat next to Sirius, which meant no one could talk to him without her listening in and batting her eyes. Of course, Remus knew that she fancied him and everything, but he wasn't sure that Sirius knew that yet. Or perhaps that was how you were supposed to act when someone fancied you. "What's been going on then?" James asked very seriously. "Do you get cold stuff, MacDonald?" She shrugged, sipping her pumpkin juice. "It's been worse this year. You must know, Remus." Remus nodded vaguely, looking away as if he were more interested in watching the Slytherins. It was a Halloween feast and everyone was in high spirits. Professor Flitwick had enchanted glittering black bats to swoop over their heads, fine silvery cobwebs glistened from the rafters, and the great hall was filled with the autumnal smells of roast pumpkin, wood smoke, and baked apples. "So," James continued slowly, "have all the Muggleborns been getting it then? Even Elephant Dung—" "Oh, for fuck's sake, Remus, please fix me!" "If you'll do my potions homework," Remus replied, quick as a dart.
Fine, anything.
"I'll give you my bloody broomstick if you'll just—" "Finite!" Remus pointed his wand at James. James stared at him, looking stunned. He cleared his throat. "Lily Evans," he said very clearly, then grinned.
Not now, Potter.
Lily turned around, her conversation with Marlene interrupted. "Will you go out with me?" "No." She turned away again. "Cheers, Moony." "Any time."
Wait,
Sirius said.
wait just a minute.
"The counter jinx was finite incantatum?" "Yep." "But that's just the standard counter spell." Remus shrugged. "I never said it was anything difficult. You purebloods don't have an ounce of common sense between you." Mary squawked with laughter, James choked on his roast potato, and Sirius slapped Remus on the back. "I swear, Moony, when it comes to evil schemes, none of us have got anything on you." Remus flushed with pride and shook him off, returning to his dinner. "Look!" Peter cried, suddenly pointing a chubby finger in the direction of the Slytherin table. A Hufflepuff second year had wandered too close to Mulciber, who stood up and was looming over them. "Yeah," Sirius whispered. "Go on, you big troll." The Hufflepuff was trembling so much they sloshed their drink, spilling most of it down their own robes, but also slightly sprinkling the toes of Mulciber's huge black shoes. The snub-nosed Slytherin grabbed the Hufflepuff by the tie. The rest of the Slytherins turned to watch, eagerly. "Clean that up, you angelic sweetie pops." Dead silence. The Hufflepuff looked confused and let out a nervous laugh. Mulciber looked stupider than usual. "What did you say, Mulciber?" Snape asked, staring at him. "Angelic sweetie pops!" Mulciber roared, red-faced. "No! I meant darling sugar plum! No! Giddy gumdrops!" The entire hall erupted in laughter. "Bloody hell," Sirius said under his breath. "Mulciber's really got a mouth on him, eh? I didn't think they'd use half of those." "Sit down, you idiot." Snape chastised the bully, who had let go of the Hufflepuff's tie and was helplessly spouting cutesy nonsense. "That was brilliant, Sirius!" Mary hugged him. Remus suddenly lost his appetite. Sirius just tossed his hair gallantly. "Just wait," he said. "That was just the beginning." Chapter 48. Third Year. Sirius turns 14. Friday, 2nd of November, 1973. Remus peered round the dorm room quietly, and finding the coast clear, crept inside. He carefully opened his trunk and shoved the package inside, covering it up with an old pair of jeans. "Hiya, Moony." A voice behind him gave Remus such a fright he dropped the trunk lid with a heavy thunk and spun round. James was emerging from the bathroom, his dark hair wet and his glasses steamed up. "Hi," he said, hoping he didn't look like he was up to anything. "Are you up to something?" James squinted at him. "No." "What are you doing?"
"Nothing."
"Is it Sirius's birthday present?" Remus's shoulders sagged. He sighed.
"Yes."
"You don't have to hide it from me, Moony." James laughed, easily throwing his towel onto his bed and beginning to get dressed. "I won't tell him." Remus just shrugged awkwardly. He'd really only wanted to hide the fact that he'd spent the last 2 hours in the 4th floor girls' loos trying to wrap the stupid thing, with moaning Myrtle cackling overhead, giving no useful advice at all. He was also trying to avoid any awkward questions about where he'd got the money. His stash of stolen cigarettes was almost now completely depleted, and he'd just about enough money left over to buy a Christmas gift for his friends, and, if he was prudent, something for himself. He didn't have his heart set on anything, but Remus rather liked the odd idea that he could just go ahead and buy something if it caught his fancy. "Lucky it's a Saturday this year," he said to James, relaxing a bit. "Do you know what we're going to do?" "Well, obviously we have to sing happy birthday at breakfast," James said very seriously. "Obviously," Remus agreed. "And lunch and dinner. I've got Quidditch practice in the morning, but I got Hooch to let me have an extra half hour on the pitch before the Ravenclaws go on, so we can do a bit of flying." "Oh, good," Remus said with a little less enthusiasm. It wasn't his idea of a good time to sit in the Quidditch stands alone on a cold November morning, but it was Sirius's birthday after all. Maybe he could bring a book. "Then I suppose I'll have to do that afternoon tea thing with Regulus and Narcissa, so we'll have to find out when that ends before we can sort out a proper party. Do you think the others will mind if we use the common room?" "Nah." Remus shook his head with confidence. No one could deny James and Sirius anything, especially a very noisy birthday party. This was true at any given time during the year, but especially this week, when the Marauders' popularity seemed to be at its peak. Remus had hardly been able to walk down a corridor since Wednesday without hearing a cheer or getting a pat on the back from fellow Gryffindors, Ravenclaws, or Hufflepuffs. The Slytherins still scowled, still glared daggers if they passed them, but they couldn't say anything. A few tried, of course. For the first 2 days after Halloween, the occasional angelic sweetie pops or honey fluffkins could be heard, and met with raucous laughter. Snape had even lost his temper completely during their Friday charms lesson and called James a lovely little poppet, which nearly killed Sirius with laughter and mortified Lily. The best part of this prank, which Remus hadn't even considered when he planned it, was that none of the Slytherins could complain to the staff about the spell, because that would mean explaining which words had been replaced. So it was a slow and immensely enjoyable process to watch as the Slytherin students tried to figure out the counter-curse by themselves. "Serves them right," Marlene giggled early that morning. "If they were Hufflepuffs, they'd have all lifted the spell by now." Overnight, the Marauders had gone from being class clowns, well liked and cheerfully tolerated, to heroes of the house war that had been brewing all year. Remus tried not to think about the long-term effects this might have, and focused instead on Sirius's upcoming 14th birthday. Somehow, 14 sounded even more mature than 13. You were definitely a teenager at 14. Mary sat with them at dinner that evening, yet again. Once or twice, Remus had thought about asking James how he felt about this new arrangement, but stopped himself. After all, James seemed not to care at all and carried on as usual, and Mary wasn't doing anything wrong by sitting at her own house table. Truthfully, Remus had not yet been able to put his finger on why her presence bothered him so much, except that she always sat next to Sirius, which he thought was a bit of an obvious display. Sirius's continued coyness about the whole subject was just as infuriating. Remus didn't like other people keeping secrets. "What time will you be free tomorrow, Black?" James asked as they tucked into crispy brown battered cod and thick-cut chips.
What do you mean?
Sirius asked, liberally splashing vinegar over his before passing the bottle to Remus. Mary, who'd been reaching for the vinegar, shot Remus a funny look. "You know what time you think your black family tea will be finished? For your birthday?"
"Oh, is it your birthday, Sirius?"
Mary smiled.
"You never said. I should have got you something."
Would you?
Sirius looked at her, mildly puzzled. He turned back to James.
I don't think the tea is happening this year. Haven't had a note.
"Oh, really?" James raised his eyebrows, which always gave him a bit of an owlish expression. Is that okay?" Sirius snorted, looking at his food.
Why wouldn't it be? Like I give a toss.
"Well, great then." James grinned, shooting a look at Peter and Remus that only they would understand. "We can crack on with planning you the messiest party Gryffindor Tower has ever seen."
"Yeah,"
Peter added for good measure.
"Am I invited?"
Mary said, sitting up straighter.
Obviously,
Remus said, his voice more sarcastic than he intended it to be.
Everyone's invited. Look, don't make a big fuss,
Sirius said, playing with his peas.
I don't feel like it much.
"Oh, why not?" Mary cooed. "It'll be fun. We'll make it as good as Remus's birthday last year. Even better."
Sirius said nothing, and James threw another look at Peter and Remus. They ate the rest of their meal in total silence. Saturday, 3rd of November, 1973. Remus woke up alone on the morning of Sirius's birthday, finding a note pinned to the bathroom door written in beautiful cursive. "Gone for Quidditch practice. Knew you wouldn't want to come, so let you lie in. See you later. S." Remus showered and then decided he might as well go to the library. He'd finished his essay on Class 3X magical creatures and wanted to get a head start on Class 4X creatures. He had recently learned that he, skinny 13-year-old Remus Lupin, was classified 5X, alongside manticores and dragons. They were going ahead with the party with or without Sirius's consent, a decision made by James and backed up by Remus. Even when he had a case of the blues, Sirius could not much resist being the centre of attention and making as much noise as possible. Peter had been put in charge of decorations and, with some help from Mary and Marlene, had come up trumps, hiding a trunk full of streamers and balloons in the third-year girls' dormitory. James handled the invitations, which as far as Remus had seen involved shouting at various students, telling them that they better be there or else. Remus was responsible for food, something which was simple enough when you had access to the map and invisibility cloak. He ate a quiet breakfast by himself with his book. Mealtimes were a much more peaceful affair since the Slytherins had been temporarily muzzled. Even those that had managed to break the spell were keeping their mouths shut, at least for a while. The book Remus was reading was so interesting that he couldn't put it down, and instead continued to read as he meandered his way slowly to the library, occasionally sticking his hand out to avoid crashing into any pillars or doorways. So it was completely his own fault when he bumped headlong into Regulus Black, knocking the younger boy to the floor.
"Oh, sorry,"
Remus said, dropping his book and automatically offering a hand to help him up. Regulus glared at him and narrowed his eyes at the scars crisscrossing Remus's wrists. He climbed to his feet unassisted, brushed himself off, and sniffing at Remus with his inherited black dignity. "Watch where you're going," he said icily.
I said sorry.
Remus replied, a bit annoyed. He didn't want to start anything, he just wanted to get to the library without any trouble. "What are you doing wandering around alone, anyway?" Regulus asked suspiciously. "Planning some other hilarious assault on our freedom of speech?" Remus scoffed. "I could ask you the same thing. Where's that creepy little Crouch kid? Anyway, you can't prove we did anything." "No," Regulus's lips curled, "but I know my brother was involved." "Oh, yeah?" "Yes. I didn't get the same words as everyone else." "Hmm?" Remus tried to look unconcerned by this, but he had no idea that Sirius had cursed his brother differently. "Every time I try to say my house's name, it comes out—" Regulus glanced furtively about himself as if he were afraid he might be overheard. "Go, Gryffindor, go." Remus burst out laughing under Regulus's imperious glare. "Sorry," Remus said for the third time. It's quite funny." "Of course you think it's funny," the younger boy sniffed. He was shorter than Remus, but somehow still managed to look down his nose at him. Your kind can't possibly understand what my brother is putting at stake. I've done my best to hide the worst of it from our parents, but he has to keep pushing it." "So is that why he's not invited to your stupid Nancy tea party?" Remus asked, angry on his friend's behalf. "Narcissa didn't think it was worth it this year." Regulus's cold stare faltered and he looked away. Remus had the impression that Regulus would have quite liked a chance to see his brother. "And this latest joke of his has just proved it. He's never going to come back." Regulus shook himself and turned in the direction of the dungeons. Remus felt a surge of sympathy and against his better judgment called him back. "Reg, wait!" Regulus turned, looking horrified by Remus's over-familiarity. But Regulus was such an ugly mouthful of a name. Worse than Remus by a mile. "Look," he hurried. "We're having a party for Sirius in the common room tonight. You can come if you—" "Don't," Regulus said sharply, looking anxious. "Don't invite me, okay? Just leave it. Tell him happy birthday for me." He walked away. With or without Regulus, the party was a roaring success. Quite literally. Every lion motif in the common room, and there were quite a few, had been enchanted to roar any time anyone said the words birthday or Sirius. The whole of Gryffindor House got involved, and Remus was pretty sure that some of the older students were passing around flasks of something a bit stronger than butterbeer that everyone else was drinking. Sirius's record player was spinning wildly at double time, and lots of the girls had got up to dance. Mary tried to haul Sirius up for "John, I'm only dancing," but he shook his head fervently and stayed on the couch with Remus and Peter. "I only know the waltz," he confided to them in a whisper, "and I'll be fucked if I ever do that again." James did get up and tried to shake his hips as close to Lily as possible, but quickly tripped over a rock in the rug and went nearly headlong into the fireplace. Sirius laughed heartily at this, and Remus was pleased to see that at least he wasn't letting his family get to him today. He decided not to tell Sirius about his encounter with Regulus just yet. It wouldn't make him any happier, so what was the point? "You're Lupin, aren't you?" A girl leaned over the back of her sofa, her long black hair brushing Remus's shoulder. He'd seen her before. She was a 6th year. Yeah," he said, jumping up. "My friend Ferriara says you're selling— come over here." He jumped and jerking his head wildly. He'd so far managed to conduct his business privately without the other Marauders knowing. "What do you want?" he asked once they were in the furthest corner away from Sirius and Peter. 2 packs or whatever you got," she said. "A galleon." "What?" she exclaimed. "But Ferriara said it was 5 sickles a pack." "I'm running low on stock," Remus said, disinterested. "Supply and demand." "Ugh, fine." She folded her arms and tossed her head. "A galleon." "Can't get 'em now. Meet me here at 7 tomorrow a.m. "On a Sunday?" "I have plenty of customers, you know." All right. "What's going on there, Moony?" Sirius eyed him as Remus returned to the couch. His suspicious look was identical to his brother's. "Not another girlfriend?" "Shut up," Remus kicked him.
Who's your girlfriend, Remus? Mary sat up, looking interested.
God, Remus thought. Where did she come from? I haven't got a girlfriend. Black's just being a dick.
Good. Mary settled down, smiling smugly. Because if you did, she twirled her corkscrew hair round one finger, I know someone who'd be really disappointed.
Oh, okay,
he replied, trying not to show how annoyed he was.
Who fancies Moony?
Sirius asked, nudging Mary. I couldn't possibly tell you, Mary replied, mimicking buttoning her lips. Remus wished she'd do that for real. For good.
Girls,
Sirius said with exasperation.
Nightmares, the bloody lot of you.
Mary mock-pouted, but said nothing more. Sirius shook his head at her, but he was smiling. Finally, he returned to Remus.
So what are you selling? That girl said you were selling something.
Nope, Remus said innocently.
She had the wrong person. I'll work it out, you know,
Sirius said, a look of glee in his deep blue eyes.
Not that I'm not entirely grateful for the excellent birthday present.
He nodded at the floor where his recently unwrapped Zonko's Deluxe Practical Joke Kit lay, proudly proclaiming, sure to complete the collection of any master prankster.
But I'm going to figure out how you paid for it eventually. I don't believe this stuff about a dead aunt leaving you money.
Your dead uncle left you money, Remus countered.
Can't touch it till I'm of age, though, can I?
Sirius said shrewdly.
No, you're up to something, Lupin, I know you. You're not Moony if you don't have a secret.
So let me have my secret, then. Remus turned his head mysteriously. Chapter 49. Third Year. Know Thyself. Saturday, 11th of November, 1973. Remus fell awake, spluttering and shivering. The room was gloomy and his breath blew out in white plumes over his head. Everything hurt. He raised his hands in front of his face and found his fingertips blue and bloody. There were splinters under his nails and more blood somewhere else. He could smell it. But he couldn't see very well in the dark, and he didn't have the energy to lift his head. His bones felt like they were made of chalk. He was so tired. Still, if there was as much blood as he thought, it probably wasn't a good idea to sleep. He ought to stay awake at least until Madame Pomfrey could arrive, which shouldn't be long. Remus lay still and focused on his breathing. There was a Gryffindor game on today as well, another thing he'd be missing. Not only that, but his friends would be too busy to visit. He turned his head and heaved. He hoped he wouldn't be sick. It was so embarrassing to be sick. He didn't have his wand with him, so he couldn't clean it up. "Good morning, Remus," Madame Pomfrey finally entered the room. "Oh dear, bit of a mess, eh?" He raised his head and promptly threw up. "I'm not sure I like all this reading you do," Madame Pomfrey tutted as she brought him a healing draught. "I know your studies are important to you, but you need rest." "I slept all morning," he replied, "and I get so bored otherwise. Do you know how the Quidditch match went?" "I'm afraid I don't," the Wendy Witch smiled. "I'm sure Mr. Potter will be up to tell you as soon as he can, though." That wasn't very likely. If they'd won, there would be a victory party, and Remus had made James promise not to miss it on his account. He accepted the potion he was giving and swallowed it all without complaint. It was bitter, but he'd grown used to it. He had to read, because if he didn't, he would have nothing to do at all except think about his fresh scars. This month the wolf had torn at his torso, which was much better than his arms or face. At least he could hide the marks easier. Remus rarely undressed in front of anyone, even once the Marauders found out about his furry little problem. No one but Madame Pomfrey had seen the true extent of the damage. Well, Sirius had, once, in second year, but neither of them had quite acknowledged that strange encounter. Still, Remus wasn't naive, and he knew that one day, however far away it would be, someone would expect him to take his top off, at the very least. It didn't bear thinking about it. Perhaps he'd just have to avoid girls altogether. "Mr. Lupin!" A cheerful voice boomed across the hospital floor, making Remus jump. It was Professor Ferox, holding 2 large jars of clear liquid in his arms. "Oh, hello," Remus gave a small wave. "Murtlap essence as promised, Pompey." The professor set down the jars. "Don't come over. Don't come over, Remus thought frantically as Professor Ferox strode across the room toward his bed.
Been in the wars, our kid?
He asked, smiling kindly. Remus wanted to shrink and hide under the bedsheets. He hated the thought of strong, energetic Ferox seeing him in his weakened state.
I'm okay.
Ferox sat down beside Remus's bed. Remus resigned himself to this fate.
Second time in here this year, eh?
The professor said, looking concerned. Remus nodded, even though it was his third moon this term. If Ferox hadn't noticed one absence, then perhaps he wouldn't connect the dots.
You know, if you need more time to do your homework, you only need to ask. I've never handed anything in late,
Remus protested.
No.
Ferox's eyes twinkled.
No, you certainly haven't.
His eyes moved to the bandages poking out of Remus's pajama vest, covering a new cut that snaked up his collarbone. Something registered in the older man's eyes, and Remus knew almost instinctively that Ferox knew.
I can do anything anyone else can,
Remus said, looking the teacher in the eye.
I can see that.
Ferox now eyed the pile of books on the bedside table.
Are all these for school?
Some of them, Remus replied.
Some are for fun. I like finding out new stuff. I like knowing stuff.
Yeah, I can tell that from your essays. Ferox was smiling again, and that made Remus relax a bit.
Do you fancy a career caring for magical creatures? Or maybe something more like your father? I hadn't thought about it,
Remus lied. Ferox laughed. He tapped the book at the top of the pile. It was borrowed from Sirius, a Muggle philosophy book.
Know thyself,
Remus, Ferox said.
Plato,
Remus said quickly. Ferox laughed again, standing up.
Exactly.
He ruffled Remus's hair before turning to leave.
Hope you feel better soon, Lupin. See you on Wednesday.
It was all very cryptic, Remus thought, realizing he'd been holding his breath for almost a minute as Ferox left the room. He hadn't started the Plato yet, only skimmed it. It wasn't the sort of thing he was usually interested in, but he'd committed to try a bit of everything. Secretly, he wanted to be able to show off to Sirius that he'd read more books. Sirius hardly spent any time reading anymore. His single-minded mission to fulfill his role as the Black family sheep meant that he'd had little time for anything other than causing trouble. He'd regret that one day, in Remus's opinion. Remus had seen plenty of boys at St. Edmund's trying to push their limits like that. The problem was, some limits weren't fences. Sometimes they were edges, with nothing on the other side. He healed pretty well, despite the brutal scarring, and Madame Pomfrey sent him back to Gryffindor Tower that evening with the understand that he did nothing except rest. He walked slowly, as promised. When he finally reached the common room, and he did not find the victory party he'd expected, but a rather subdued atmosphere, and the Marauders were nowhere to be seen. Remus furrowed his brow and headed up to the stairs to find the bedroom, also empty. Puzzled, he went back downstairs. Marlene and Mary were playing Snap by the fireplace.
Hiya,
he went over.
All right, Remus, where you been?
Mary asked, not looking up from her cards.
Been sick, stomach bug. How was the game?
We lost, Marlene sighed.
James was bloody brilliant as usual, and I must have blocked at least 20 bludgers, but Ramsay caught the snitch right at the wrong time. Oh, sorry, McKinnon.
Remus rubbed the back of his head. That was odd. If they'd lost and there'd been no party, then why hadn't the others come to see him? He tried to ignore the stabbing feeling in his stomach.
You seen James since, or Sirius, or anyone?
No, the girls said in unison. Marlene slammed down a card, then winced as it blew up. She looked up.
Want to play?
Nah. I feel a bit funny. Gonna go lie down.
Thanks, though.
He trudged back up the stairs, feeling an uncomfortable mix of anxiety and anger. He said they shouldn't put off celebrating just for him, but that didn't mean he didn't want to see them at all. They didn't have to leave him on his own like that, without so much as checking to see if he was all right. For all they knew, he could be in the infirmary still, at death's door, and with no one but Madame Pomfrey for company. Were they bored of the whole thing? Was it less exciting now? Was he less exciting? Remus lay on his bed, on top of the covers. He felt like he'd only been out of pyjamas for an hour. He didn't want to get back into them, no matter how tired he was. He considered reading, but he didn't have the energy. He could listen to a record, but that would mean getting up. In the end, he stayed put, lying in the dark with the curtains down. At St. Edmund's, before he could read, before he'd had magic or friends, Remus had grown used to boredom. He would make up stories in his head, run through song lyrics he'd memorized, or try to come up with the longest words he'd ever heard. Now, as he waited for sleep to come, Remus pondered on what Ferox had said to him earlier. Know thyself. He couldn't remember the context for Plato having said that. It had to mean, know who you are. Remus knew all about his friends. He knew that James was a natural leader, a Quidditch god who would do anything for anyone. Remus knew that even though they all teased James for being infatuated with Lily, James had a clearer understanding of love than anyone, and if he had said he was going to marry her one day, then he probably would. Remus knew that Peter was ashamed of his family, especially his older sister, who he'd once looked up to, and that fitting in meant more to him than anything else in the world. Remus knew that Mary's parents were born in Jamaica, and that she was the only witch in a family of 7, and that she never, ever cried, even when she was furious. He knew that Lily cried every time she got a letter from home, and that she wrote to her sister every week and hadn't once received a response. He knew that Marlene didn't get on with her dad, who was a muggle and drank too much sometimes. Then there was Sirius. But it took nothing special to know Sirius. He thought he was aloof and mysterious, but the truth was that Black wore his heart on his sleeve and kept nothing back. He felt everything so strongly, and his happiness was as chaotic as his misery. Sometimes you had to take a step back in case you got dragged under his wheels. Who was Remus, then? An orphan. But not quite. A wizard, but only half-blood. A monster, but not every day. What else was there? No need to flesh out supporting characters too much. Moony! The whisper filled the room as loud as a klaxon. Remus didn't reply. He was too grumpy. The door opened and 3 sets of footsteps entered. Even with the bed curtains drawn, Remus knew it was James who approached first. Psst! Moony, you sleeping, mate? He sighed and rolled over. No. The curtains were pulled aside. Remus sat up to make room as James, then Sirius, then Peter crawled inside to sit with him. We went to the hospital wing, but she said you'd gone already, James explained. Came up after dinner. Where were you? Library. How was it? Sirius asked. The full moon and everything. Okay. He gave the same answer every month. It wasn't... I mean, you weren't cut up too much? Peter asked, wringing his hands. A bit, Remus nodded. Not too bad. What were you doing in the library? That's something we wanted to talk to you about, Sirius burst out. Obviously, he was dying to say something, and Remus felt the last of his irritation melt away as his curiosity peaked. Sirius, James said in the voice he used to temper his friends. He looked at Remus. We're doing some research, and it's sort of about you. Sort of? Sirius scoffed. It's all about you, Moony. I've wanted to tell you since last term, but James wouldn't... I just wanted to make sure we could do it, James elbowed Sirius. Stop interrupting me. Bloody hell. Remus, the thing is, ever since we found out about, your furry little problem, we've wanted to do something to help. There's no cure, Remus replied quickly. He didn't like the sound of this. He felt horribly self-conscious as they all stared at him with the same mad look in their eyes. No, we know that, James waved a hand. But we thought there must be something we could do to make you stop hurting yourself, you know? We found out that normal werewolves don't do that, Peter said, eager to have his own way. So we... Normal? Remus said, alarmed. Not normal, Sirius kicked Peter. Others like you, who don't get locked up during the moon. Right. So you're probably doing it to yourself because you're trapped and frustrated. Well, yeah, I knew that. Remus drew his knees up to his chest and inched back a bit. He wished they weren't on his bed. They were all much too close. He could smell their blood. He could hear it rushing in their veins. But we thought if you had company... Obviously not human company, James explained hurriedly. Everything we've read said that even if you get near a human, then they're a goner.
But animals,
Sirius exploded.
other animals would probably be fine.
His eyes shone with excitement, and Remus wished he could return it, but he was too distracted to be able to follow what they were saying.
So what? I need a pet?
James laughed.
Sort of, but we thought
We could be the animals. Remus stared at him. He looked at his friends in turn. They were all barking mad.
you're going to be the animals.
He said flatly.
Like McGonagall.
Peter squeaked.
Yeah, but she's an animagus. You have to study and train and get registered. You can't even start until you're 17. Moony, Moony, Moony.
Sirius shook his head infuriatingly.
We're Marauders. We don't need to bother with all that. Even if you wanted to break the law.
Remus caught James's eye on that point to confirm that this was definitely what they were talking about.
This isn't some school prank. It's serious magic. One of the hardest things to do. That's why we're telling you about it,
Sirius said.
I wanted it all to be a surprise, but James reminded us that, well, it is really bloody hard, so the more help we can get, the better. You really think you can do it, don't you?
Remus frowned. If you help us, James nodded. We're the best students in the year, except for Evans. Don't see why we shouldn't try.
And what if it goes wrong?
Remus chewed his lip.
What if after I transform, what if I can tell you're not really animals? What if I go for you anyway? We'll test it. We'll test it over and over until we know it's safe,
Sirius said.
It's so risky. I know.
Black's eyes were practically blazing in his head now, and Remus knew there was no point in trying to be reasonable. He took a deep breath.
Let me think about it, okay?
He appealed to James.
Don't do anything yet. Just give me a few days.
Okay, James nodded. That's fair.
Just think, Moony.
Sirius grinned as if he hadn't heard them.
Once we've done this, there'll be nothing we can't do. We'll be unstoppable.
Chapter 50, 3rd Year. Philomena Pettigrew. Friday, 21st of December, 1973. Once he'd finally been given the space to think about it, Remus wondered why he'd even asked for more time. Of course he would say yes. He didn't think he'd ever say no to his friends, even if it did make him nervous. And it did make him nervous. Perhaps it was their excitement that worried him, or their overconfidence. He knew that part of their eagerness had to do with the plan being incredibly illegal, dangerous, and reckless. But they were also doing it for him. He wasn't sure how to feel about that yet. Better not think about it. He took James aside one day, not long after they'd proposed the idea, and asked for all the research they had so far. It was promptly presented to him as a huge bundle of parchment, reams and reams of notes and diagrams penned in a familiar neat cursive script. To say that they'd been thorough was an understatement. If only Sirius had paid as much attention to writing his essays, Remus would never have a hope of beating him to the top of the class. They'd left no stone unturned. They'd charted the full moons for the next decade at least. They'd practically written an entire history of European lycanthropy, along with feeding habits and migration patterns, pack behavior, canine communication signals. They'd listed every ingredient they would need, its cost and its availability. Every ritual was carefully transcribed, step by step, and the incantations spelled out phonetically. There were timelines, suggested locations for certain aspects of the extensive process. Everything was painstakingly detailed.
Christ,
Remus said when he finished reading it.
You've done all this?
It was mostly serious, James grinned. Actually, basically all of it was serious. He did most of it over the summer holidays while he was bored. A real labour of love. Remus's stomach flipped. He didn't know what to say. How could he refuse them after all that? Suddenly, selling stolen cigarettes to underage wizards seemed very tame indeed. It was agreed that work would begin in earnest over the Christmas holidays, when they would all be away from Hogwarts. Remus had secured permission from Matron McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey to spend the break with the Potters, and, as always, Peter was only up the road. Sirius was in a dark mood as term drew to a close, until he received a very short note during breakfast one morning. To Master S.O. Black III. You will not be required at the family home this winter break. Do as you please. Signed, Orion Black.
Yes!
James cheered, almost knocking over his porridge.
Might even get you for the summer at this rate.
What about Regulus? Remus asked tentatively, quietly, in case Sirius wanted to pretend he hadn't heard.
Oh, little Prince Reg is going home for Christmas,
Sirius replied, shoving the note in his pocket.
It's just me they've disinvited. Good. Perfect. Excellent. They don't care. I don't care.
He didn't properly cheer up until they were packing. Sirius covertly showed Remus the gifts he'd bought for Mr. and Mrs. Potter, a beautiful golden watch chain and a pretty garnet brooch.
Do you think they're okay? He asked nervously. My family's shit at doing presents, so I never really know. Black, Sirius, they're perfect, don't worry.
Remus felt a sinking feeling as he thought about the slightly shabby box of mid-range biscuits he'd bought for his host. It couldn't be helped now. He'd done his best. Remus was actually looking forward to Christmas this year, for what might have been the very first time. He was still a bit shy about spending time in someone else's house, but now that he knew how the Potters were, he relaxed into the idea. He had sold the very last of his illicit cigarettes at a premium and bought presents for everyone he could, even Lily, Mary, and Marlene. It was a real pleasure giving people presents, he realized, maybe even better than getting them. In addition, despite some nervous reservations, Remus was excited about beginning the animagus process. It would be some of the most complex magic they'd ever performed yet. He'd asked McGonagall about it, as subtly as possible. She had praised him for taking an interest, but said it was well above third-year standard or even seventh year. He relished the thought of proving her wrong. There was one other thing he was hoping to get out of break, something he hadn't mentioned to the others because it was private. Last year, at the Potters' Christmas party, Remus had been accosted by an old man who knew a lot about Lupin. At the time, Remus had been struck mute by the revelation and shock of it, but now, a year older and feeling quite mature at the grand old age of 13, Remus hoped he might learn a bit more. Saturday, 22nd of December, 1973. The full moon had fallen earlier in the month this year, so all four of the Marauders were able to join their peers aboard the Hogwarts Express on the usual Saturday. In a change from their usual train journey, Marlene and Mary joined the boys in their carriage. Remus suspected that Lily was somewhere on her own with Severus, probably listening to him whinge about how nobody liked him.
"Did you get your essay back off Ferox?" Marlene asked Remus, a deep crease in her brow. "Only barely got an acceptable mark, and Mum's going to go mental if I don't get better results this year." "Yeah, I did okay," Remus replied, embarrassed by his third outstanding that term. "We'll bring back the study club after Christmas, right?" Marlene put in. "Lily's up for it. Don't worry, Miles, you'll do fine." "Sounds good," Remus nodded. "Moony's joined a club without us," Sirius wailed, pretending to weep on James's shoulder. "He's a big boy now," James patted his friend solemnly. "They grow up so fast." "Piss off," Remus grinned. "They have Slug Club for poshos like you." "You can study with us if you want, Sirius," Mary purred. Sirius looked alarmed. He used the library exclusively as a resource for jinx and hexes, not for doing anything so mundane as homework. Mary didn't know Sirius. Not really. When they pulled into King's Cross, Remus felt a certain thrill when he saw Mr. and Mrs. Potter were there to collect all of them. Usually he had to cross the barrier and go looking for Matron in the cafe or by the newspaper stand. He was in for a shock, however, when he learned that he was about to apparate for the very first time. "Hold my arm, dear," Mrs. Potter smiled at him kindly. "Close your eyes, and it'll be over in a moment." Remus obeyed, scrunching his eyes shut. It was much worse than flu powder. Worse than flying. He nearly dragged Mrs. Potter down with him when they landed, as he lost his balance and fell hard on the pavement outside the Potter's house. "Whoops-a-daisy," Mrs. Potter laughed kindly, pulling him up again. "You're all right now." She brushed his knees and shoulders. "Now, I'll just pop back for Sirius. Monty will be over with James in 2 ticks." With a crack, she vanished.
Remus barely had time to lean on the low front gate and catch his breath before there was another crack, and Mr. Potter appeared with James, who didn't look half as bad as Remus felt. Once they were all there, Mrs. Potter ushered them all into the house, sending their trunks flying up the stairs to their respective bedrooms, boiling a kettle and slicing some homemade Madeira cake, all in what felt like a few seconds. As Remus sat at the Potters' big wooden kitchen table, eating cake and sipping a huge mug of tea, listening to James and Sirius chatter 19 to the dozen about the term so far, he couldn't resist sighing contentedly to himself. 2 whole weeks of this. Unfortunately, unlike the previous year, there'd been no snow yet this winter, only rain. In fact, as the evening drew on, the downpour grew heavier and heavier until thunder cracked open on the sky outside and hailstones battered the window panes. Rather than go outside, the boys sat in the living room under the Christmas tree playing games and toasting the occasional tea cake on the fire. Remus himself settled into a book on human transfiguration, and Mrs. Potter reviewed her list for the coming celebrations. "We have a few more people coming this year," she explained as the long, thin strips of parchment hovered before her, a royal blue quill working quickly across the surface, ticking off various items. "Some friends from the old days and some newer acquaintances." As she said this, she glanced furtively over Sirius, who wasn't paying attention, immersed in the game. "Only just have enough room for all of you," she continued with a happy smile that was just like her son's. Just then there was a knock at the door. Sirius sat bolt upright as if he'd been struck by lightning. He turned to Mrs. Potter, wide-eyed. It wasn't his mother, Remus knew this, but didn't say so, because how on earth would that sound? "Don't worry, Sirius, I know your mother's sent." Too bloody creepy. Mrs. Potter got up, leaving the lists hovering in mid-air, and went to the door. A cold breeze blew in, and the 3 boys listened intently. It was a woman, but her voice was higher and younger than that of Walpurga Black. She sounded as though she was crying, and Mrs. Potter spoke in soothing tones. "Boys!" she called from the hallway. They got up and went to meet her. She was standing just inside the kitchen doorway. Behind her, a young woman with long blonde hair was at the table, her head in her hands. "What's up, Mum?" James asked, craning his neck. "It's getting late. You all better get to bed. Philly's staying the night, and I'm afraid we've no room left. Sirius, would you mind sharing with James tonight, dear?" "We can all share," James said generously. "Everyone else is arriving tomorrow anyway. Might as well all just bunk up together." Mrs. Potter nodded and summoned the house elf. James's bedroom was absolutely perfect in every way. Huge and spacious, the walls were plastered with Gryffindor banners and Quidditch posters. Every broom he'd ever owned was mounted on the wall, and his shelves were packed with wizard children's books and old toys that clearly he wasn't ready to get rid of just yet. Chief among them was a little knight figurine, apparently supposed to be Godric Gryffindor himself, marching back and forth along the edge of the bookcase. The bed was huge and hung with red velvet drapes, the same as their dorm room, and though it was big enough for all 3 of them, the house elf had whipped up 2 single beds which lay at the foot of it. "Who was that?" Remus asked as they all sat on the big bed together in their pyjamas. "Philomena," James said. "Pete's sister." "What's she doing here?" "I think she's been having arguments with Pete's folks. They don't like her going to Muggle University, and—" he lowered his voice. "Dad says she's got a Muggle boyfriend." "Really?" Sirius's eyes widened in awe. Remus said nothing. He hadn't known that going out with Muggles was particularly taboo. "Yeah, and you know what Mum's like," James nudged Sirius. "Loves taking in strays." Christmas Eve, 1973. Philomena was present at breakfast the next morning and remained there for the whole of Christmas. At first she didn't say very much, but stared into space, pale-faced and red-eyed. From what Remus had gathered, going out with a Muggle was not only taboo, but an offence worthy of disowning your own child. Apart from the Potters, Remus couldn't help but think that wizards did not make very good parents, based on his experience. Peter's sister was about 7 years older than him, and you might not know that they were related at all, except for the straw-coloured hair. Where Pete was round and podgy, Philomena was slim and dainty-featured. She had chocolate brown eyes and a delicate smattering of pale brown freckles over her little nose. Her hair was worn in the same style as many Muggle girls Remus had seen, long and poker-straight with a thick parted fringe, like Marianne Faithfull. James, who knew her best, could not do enough for the pretty visitor. He offered her tea, held out her chair, and generally became her willing servant until even Sirius had had enough of him.
Bloody hell, Potter, she's just a girl.
I'm being nice, James frowned. Nothing wrong with being nice to my mate's sister. They hadn't seen Peter. Once Mrs. Pettigrew learned where her daughter was staying, he'd been confined to the house. They were making do by sending owls back and forward, which was probably more fun for James and Sirius than it was for Peter.
What on earth would Evans say?
Sirius teased James, who turned bright red.
She'd be glad someone's taking his mind off her,
Remus suggested from where he was lounging on his camp bed. You can talk, Black, James shoved his friend. What's going on between you and Mary?
MacDonald?
Sirius asked innocently.
Don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, come on, James groaned. Tell us, have you snogged her or what? Remus dropped his book. Snogging? Since when was snogging on the cards? Sirius gave her a coy look.
No. Kissed her on the cheek, though.
Oh, how scandalous, Black! James threw a pillow at him. Sirius threw it back, and all of a sudden they were wrestling. Remus usually just rolled his eyes and let them get on with it, but now he used the distraction to gather his thoughts. He felt very childish and silly, not having realized that Sirius liked Mary back. There was kissing involved now, even if it was just a peck on the cheek. Remus racked his brain, trying to pull himself in Sirius's position. If a girl liked you, you pretty much had to kiss them. Wasn't that the case? Was it awful if a girl didn't like you? If Sirius now liked Mary, and James now liked Lily, ought he to pick a girl too? Marlene was okay, a bit shy like him. Maybe Marlene then. The thought kept him up that night long after James and Sirius had fallen asleep. They both slept in James's bed. Sirius had simply climbed in on the first night, and James hadn't said a word. Remus kept to himself on his designated camp bed. He tried to take his mind off it, think about Christmas and stocking and crackers. But it was all in vain. All he could think about was Sirius kissing Mary's cheek. And where had they done it? When had it happened? What did it feel like? Eventually, restless and overwrought, he got up to get some water. He padded out of the room into the bathroom across the hall and ran the tap. He sipped some of the tepid water and looked at himself in the mirror. In the dim light, he couldn't see his scars. Would a girl ever like him if he looked the way he did? He would never be as good-looking as Sirius or even James, but perhaps he was slightly better than Peter? How on earth could you know? Suddenly the lights flashed on, burning his retinas so that he almost dropped his glass.
Oh! Sorry!
Philomena stood in the doorway in a long peach-coloured nightie. She looked shocked.
What on earth are you doing wandering around in the dark? I've pretty good eyesight,
he mumbled, stepping away from the sink.
I couldn't sleep.
Me either, she sighed. Once the surprise had left her face, she looked sad again. Remus hoped she wouldn't cry. He was useless with crying. Oh God, if he got a girlfriend, would he have to deal with crying? He had no time to swallow back his panic before Philomena began talking again. It's horrible to be away from family at Christmas, isn't it?
I grew up in a children's home, actually.
Oh, really? She looked interested for a moment. You're one of Peter's little friends, aren't you? I didn't know he knew any Muggleborns. Kept that quiet from Mummy.
My dad was a wizard, Remus said with some confidence. But he died.
Half-blood, she murmured. But even so... She trailed off despondently. Remus shifted uncomfortably. His bare feet were beginning to get cold on the bathroom tiles, and he was only wearing his underwear and a vest to sleep in, which was embarrassing enough. She didn't seem to mind. You're lucky, she said, not having to grow up with all this shit. You mean magic? Remus frowned. He'd never heard a witch or wizard, pure blood or Muggleborn, talk this way. Yeah, magic, she sniffed. What's so bloody good about magic, eh? What makes us so special? Do you want to know a secret? He didn't, but thought it better not to say so. She carried on anyway, whispering now. I wish I was a Muggle sometimes. she said, a glimmer of madness in her eye.
If I could do it, I'd run away forever and never be found. And I'd have a nice normal job and a nice normal life. And I'd fall in love with whoever I want.
At this last affirmation, she burst into tears.
You could do that anyway if you wanted,
Remus said quickly, not sure why he was saying what he was saying. She looked at him suspiciously.
What do you mean?
Well, what's stopping you? He asked. You're of age. You can do what you like. Go and be a waitress, or run away to America and be a film star. Marry Prince Charles if you want to. I mean, you might need to use a bit of magic to get started, but you could give it up. No one says you have to do magic.
She stared at him and looked him up and down.
No one's ever told me that before.
Remus shrugged.
What's your name again?
Remus Lupin.
Oh!
She burst out laughing.
You poor thing! That's almost as bad as Philomena.